The door didn't splinter when Victor Hale kicked it open. That was the thing Clara Bennett would never forget, how quietly the wood gave way, as if even the house had stopped fighting him. He walked in without hurrying, straightening his cufflinks while two of his men stood in the hallway behind him, and looked around the bedroom she'd been using for 3 years like he was inspecting a horse stall that needed mucking out. "You thought you could leave," he said, not a question, not even angry, really just the flat, certain voice of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. He picked up the small photograph from her nightstand, her mother, taken the summer before she died, and turned it over in his fingers. Then he set it face down on the dresser, deliberate, unhurried, like he was erasing something. Clara was 26 years old and had exactly $11 hidden in the lining of her winter coat. She had a carpetbag half-packed on the floor and a jar of sourdough starter wrapped in cloth on the windowsill. And she had the absolute bone-deep certainty, standing in that room while Victor smiled at her, that if she didn't get out that night, she never would. If you've ever stood in a room where someone looked at you like you were a problem they owned the solution to, you already know how that feels. If you haven't, this story will show you exactly what it costs a woman to walk through that door anyway. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Stories like Clara's take real courage to tell, and your support is what keeps us bringing them to you. And drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that night. Let's go back to the moment Clara Bennett decided she was done being owned. Chicago in January had a particular kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it got inside your thinking. It made small fears feel enormous and enormous decisions feel impossible, which was Clara had come to understand exactly why Victor had moved her there in the first place. She had come to him at 23, which was younger than she liked to admit when she thought about it now. Her mother had been sick for 8 months by then, the long, grinding kind of sick that hollowed out a household before it hollowed out a person, and Clara had been working double shifts at the bakery, where she'd trained since she was 17, trying to keep them both afloat. Victor had come in one Tuesday morning, ordered a coffee he didn't drink, and watched her work for 45 minutes before he introduced himself. He was 41 then, well-dressed in a way that read as taste rather than money, which she later understood was the point. He had kind eyes, or she had believed they were kind, which was a different thing entirely. He'd asked about the bread she was scoring, genuinely curious seeming, and they'd talked for an hour before she realized she was late, relieving the woman on the next shift. He came back the next morning, and the one after. By the time her mother's condition deteriorated to the point where the medical bills were requiring decisions Clara didn't know how to make, Victor was already offering solutions. A private physician, a better facility, arrangements that would allow Clara to stop working for a while and simply be present for whatever time her mother had left. She had told herself it wasn't what it looked like, that reasonable men did reasonable kindnesses, that she wasn't so desperate that she couldn't see clearly. She had been exactly that desperate, and not nearly that clear-eyed. Her mother died in April. The private room had been beautiful, which was something, and Clara had been there, which was the only thing that actually mattered. But in the weeks that followed, as grief settled in and she tried to think about what came next, she began to notice the shape of the arrangement she'd entered. Victor had paid for everything. That was the fact that kept surfacing, no matter how she tried to frame it differently. The physician, the facility, the small funeral, the 3 months of rent she'd fallen behind on, all of it traced back to him. And he had never, not once, spoken of it directly. Never said, "You owe me," or "This is a loan," or made any explicit demand. He simply mentioned in passing various things Clara might enjoy, or might find helpful, and was gracious when she agreed, and subtly colder when she hesitated, in a way she couldn't quite point to or name. He proposed 8 months after her mother died. She said yes because she didn't know how to say no in a way he would accept, and because she had persuaded herself that she was choosing, and because the alternative, figuring out how to live on her own in a city where she knew no one well, with no savings and a grief that had taken the structural beams out of her, felt worse than staying. She was 24. She thought she was being practical. The next 2 years taught her the difference between a choice made under pressure and a choice freely made. By the time she understood the distinction, she was already too deep in. Victor didn't hit her. She wanted to be precise about that, because it mattered to how people would later refuse to believe her. He didn't raise his voice, mostly. He didn't lock doors or take her money because there was no money of her own to take. He handled all of it, reasonably, efficiently, in a way he described as thoughtful management, and she eventually understood as control. He curated her friendships, suggested she was probably too tired, or too sensitive, or too prone to misremembering things, when her version of events differed from his. Told her she was fortunate regularly, in a tone that made the word feel like a collar. She started baking in the house kitchen after the first year, not because anyone asked her to, but because it was the one thing she knew how to do that he couldn't critique or correct. He didn't understand the chemistry of bread. He didn't know what a proper crust should sound like when you knocked it. When she had flour on her hands, she was the expert, and he was just a man watching from the doorway, and those were the only moments when something in her chest unclenched. She made her plan over the course of 6 months. It was not a dramatic plan. It was a small, practical plan built on the understanding that dramatic plans required resources she didn't have. She saved what she could from grocery money, small amounts, carefully calculated, never enough to notice in a single week. She wrote a letter to a ranch advertisement she'd seen in a paper a woman at the market had left behind, something about seeking household help in Montana, and she mailed it from the post office 2 blocks away while Victor was at his club. The reply came addressed to a false name she'd given. She picked it up at the post office. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She had learned by then that telling people things gave Victor material. The night she left, she'd had everything ready for 3 weeks, waiting for a window. He was supposed to be in Milwaukee. His travel had been confirmed, his bags packed, his plans made. She had planned to be on a train before he reached the hotel. He came home at midnight instead. Business concluded early, he said, setting his case down in the hallway. And then he looked at her. Really looked, the way he did when he suspected something, which was a particular look she'd spent 2 years learning to deflect, and she understood that she had perhaps 10 minutes before he found the carpetbag. She didn't go back for the bag. She didn't go back for anything except the jar of sourdough starter she'd been keeping alive for 2 years, the last thing her mother had given her, wrapped in cloth on the windowsill. She walked out the kitchen door while Victor was still in the front hallway, and she walked 3 blocks in the January cold without a coat before she stopped shaking enough to flag a cab. She was on a train to Montana before the sun came up. The train took 31 hours and she slept for maybe 4 of them, sitting upright in the cheapest car with the carpetbag she'd recovered from the station locker on her lap, and the sourdough jar wedged between her hip and the window so it wouldn't get cold. She had $9.40 left after the ticket. She had a name, Wyatt Mercer, Ironridge Ranch, outside a town called Millhaven, and a letter that said the position was still available when she'd written. She had not written to confirm it was still available before she left. She had not had time for that. The train rattled through landscapes that got progressively larger and emptier until she felt like something small dropped into an enormous room. Illinois gave way to Iowa, Iowa to Nebraska, Nebraska eventually to the big cold sky of Montana, and she watched the country change through the window and tried not to think about what she would do if no one was at the station. There was no one at the station. The platform was a plank of wood, a hanging lantern, and 2 other passengers who both walked off into the dark before she'd finished gathering herself. The town itself was visible as a scattered collection of lit windows about a quarter-mile away. It was snowing lightly, and the temperature was a particular kind of cold she had no adequate comparison for. She stood on the platform for about 4 minutes before she admitted to herself that she needed to move, or she was going to become a real problem. The general store was still open barely, a man bolting the shutters when she came up, and she asked him if he knew how to get to Ironridge Ranch. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone doing rapid calculations about what kind of woman showed up in Millhaven in January, with a carpetbag and no horse. "You apply for that kitchen position?" he asked. "Yes." He shrugged. "Rusk was in yesterday. He'll be back through tomorrow morning. You can try the boarding house." He pointed down the street, gave her a price that was within her remaining $9, and went back to his shutters. She found the boarding house. She paid for a room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and held the sourdough jar against her chest until it warmed. And then she set it carefully on the windowsill and lay down with her coat still on and stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She'd expected to, alone finally, but there wasn't anything to cry out. She'd wrung herself dry somewhere in Nebraska. What she felt was something more like the strange, vertiginous quiet of a clock that had been running fast for years and suddenly stopped. Everything ached. Her feet, her back, her jaw from 3 days of holding it set. She felt simultaneously like she might sleep for a week, and like she might never sleep again. She thought about her mother, about the bread her mother had made on Sunday mornings, the specific weight and warmth of a loaf fresh from the oven. The way the starter had a smell that meant home before home was something she'd lost. The jar sat on the windowsill, and she watched it in the dark until she fell asleep. Colton Rusk had the face of a man who'd been unpleasant so long it had settled in. He was somewhere around 50, weathered to the consistency of old saddle leather, with the kind of squint that wasn't about sun so much as it was about chronic skepticism of everything in his field of vision. He showed up at the boarding house at 7 in the morning, spoke to her for approximately 4 minutes on the porch in the cold, and made clear, without quite saying it directly, that he thought this was going to be a waste of everyone's time. Ranch kitchen's been sitting empty since September, he said. Previous woman left. Before that, no one could stick it. It's not a soft situation. I didn't come out here for soft, Clara said. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were unconvinced by, but prepared to observe for evidence. Mr. Mercer said to bring anyone who replied. He'll make the final call. The ride out to Ironridge took an hour in the cold, and Colton didn't speak for most of it except to tell her once that the ranch was about 4,000 acres, and that Mr. Mercer ran a cattle operation that supplied several contracts north and east of Millhaven. He said it the way people said things they expect to be impressive and are mildly irritated when the listener doesn't visibly react. Clara nodded and watched the country open up around them, and thought about the sourdough jar wrapped in her coat pocket. Ironridge materialized out of the snow as a series of dark shapes, buildings, fences, a large barn. The main house set back from the others with its windows lit against the gray morning. It was nothing like she'd pictured and everything she'd hoped, which was a strange combination that she filed away without examining too closely. Wyatt Mercer met them in the yard. She had not known what to expect from the name. The letter had been businesslike, almost terse, and she'd constructed a rough mental image from that. The man standing in the yard didn't match any of it. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind that wasn't just height but proportion and broad in the shoulders, in the way of someone who'd worked for it, not someone born to it. He was maybe 35, though the lines around his eyes pushed that estimate a few years in both directions. He had the particular stillness of a man who'd spent a lot of years outdoors, learning that unnecessary movement costs warmth, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not skeptical exactly, not warm either. Something more like watchful. Miss Bennett, he said. Not a greeting quite, more like confirmation. Mr. Mercer, he looked at the carpetbag. That everything?
Yes.
Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. Kitchen's through the main house. Second door on the left past the hall. Colton can show you. He glanced at Rusk. Let her look at it before any decisions get made. Colton walked her inside without comment. The kitchen was a disaster. That was not an exaggeration for effect. The stove was cold and had not been properly cleaned in what looked like months. The grease had built up, and then congealed in the damp cold until it was practically archaeological. The work table had been used for everything except food preparation, judging by the collection of tools, rope, and inexplicable debris occupying its surface. 2 of the shelves had come partially away from the wall. There was a crack in the window that someone had stuffed with a rag, and the cold came through anyway. The only things suggesting the room had ever been a kitchen were the stove itself, a substantial Dutch oven with a broken handle, and a flour bin that still had maybe 15 pounds in it. Colton watched her take it in. She could feel him waiting for the reaction. She set the carpetbag on the table, moved a coil of rope to the floor, and started looking for the woodpile. There's wood around the side, he said, after a moment. I'll need it. He blinked. You're staying? I said I'd look at the kitchen. She turned around. I've looked at it. I'll need that wood, and something to get this stove clean before I can light it, and a bucket with some hot water if there's anywhere on this ranch with a fire already going. He stared at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said bunkhouse has a fire and went to get it. She didn't know in that moment whether she was making the right decision. She had $9, a jar of sourdough starter, and a kitchen that looked like it had been abandoned mid-argument. She didn't know if Wyatt Mercer would hire her formally or how much he'd pay, or whether the previous women who'd left had very good reasons for leaving. What she knew was that her hands had found a job that needed doing, and that was the only quiet she knew how to make. She worked through the day. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't ask for help, except for the wood and the water, and she was sparing with both. She tore everything off the shelves, scrubbed the stove grates with ash and fat in the way her mother had shown her, relit the firebox with wood she'd split herself because the pieces Colton brought were too large, and she didn't trust them to catch clean. The window crack she plugged more thoroughly with oiled cloth she found in a drawer. The shelves she braced with a method she invented on the spot that involved a piece of trim from the floor she was fairly sure no one was currently using. By mid-afternoon, the stove was burning steadily, and the kitchen smelled like scorched metal giving way to clean metal, which was progress. She made bread. She made it the way she always made it, by weight and feel rather than recipe, folding in the sourdough starter she'd kept alive across 1,000 miles of train travel, shaping 2 loaves with the deliberateness of someone doing something worth doing carefully. She put them in the Dutch oven with a lid on and slid it into the stove and waited. The first man came in at 5, probably looking for something, and stopped in the doorway with an expression of someone who'd walked into the wrong room. "Kitchen's not open," Clara said without turning around. "Just looked like you had a fire going." "I do." "Kitchen's still not open." There was a pause. "Smells like bread." "It is bread. Come back in an hour." She heard him leave. Then she heard him talking to someone outside. Then she heard 2 voices. She didn't turn around. When she pulled the loaves out an hour later, there were 4 men she hadn't been introduced to standing in the doorway of the kitchen with varying expressions of studied casualness that fooled no one. She cut a loaf open, still a little hot, which she'd have preferred to avoid, but she'd lost track of time, and put the slices on the table without ceremony. No one spoke for a moment. "There's no butter," she said. "There will be tomorrow." The one who'd come first picked up a slice, chewed it, looked at the ceiling in a way that meant he was trying not to react and failing. "That's bread," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "That's the idea." She heard Colton's step before she saw him heavier than the others, the gait of a man who'd spent 40 years on this ground. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the men, looked at the table, looked at her. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd make bread." He crossed to the table, took a slice, and ate it standing up. His expression changed by the smallest possible margin, but she caught it. "Mr. Mercer will want to see you in the morning," he said. "I assumed." He left without another word. Clara gathered the remaining bread, covered it, and began making a list in her head of what she'd need to do with the kitchen before she could call it functional. The list was long, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down. But there was something underneath the exhaustion that she recognized from years back from her early days at the bakery, from the first time she'd taken over the morning shift alone and gotten every loaf right. The feeling of a day that had gone exactly as she'd pushed it. She woke before 4 in the morning, which was nothing new, and lay for a moment in the small room off the kitchen that Colton had indicated with a gesture the night before. The room held a cot, a nail on the wall, and a square of window showing nothing but dark. It was cold enough that she could see her breath if she looked. She pulled on 2 layers and went to start the stove. She was deep in the second batch of dough plain rolls. Nothing complicated, enough to feed a full bunkhouse breakfast when she heard the sound in the hall. Small footsteps, the hesitant kind. She didn't move or turn around. She kept her hands in the dough. The footsteps stopped at the doorway for a long time. Long enough that a different kind of person would have turned around to look. Clara stayed where she was and rolled the dough and waited. Eventually, a child appeared in her peripheral vision. A small girl, 6 years old perhaps, dark-haired, wearing a nightgown and thick socks, and an expression of absolute seriousness, combined with something that looked like it had been terrified for a long time, and was only now beginning to consider the possibility of not being terrified. Clara still didn't turn. "There's a draft from the back window," she said conversationally, to no one in particular. "You'd want to stay closer to the stove side if you're cold." The footsteps moved slowly to the stove side of the kitchen. Clara divided the dough and began shaping rolls. "I'm making breakfast," she said. "There's more than I can eat." Silence. Then the soft sound of a small body settling onto the floor near the stove's warmth. Clara worked for another 20 minutes. She didn't look at the child and she didn't speak again. When the first batch of rolls went in, she cut a small wedge from the previous day's bread, still good. Just firmer, spread it with the butter she'd found in the cold storage, and set it on the low shelf of the work table, within easy reach of a 6-year-old sitting on the floor. She went back to her rolls. The bread was gone in 5 minutes. She heard the small sound of the wedge being picked up, the careful chewing, the silence that followed. A silence that felt, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, like relief. She still hadn't looked directly at the girl when Wyatt's voice came from the doorway. "Nora." His voice was low, controlled, with something beneath it that Clara recognized as the sound of a person who was constantly managing themselves around a very particular kind of grief. "You're supposed to be in bed." Clara turned then, because there was no natural way not to, and she saw Wyatt Mercer's, in the early morning light, looking at his daughter with an expression she hadn't expected. It wasn't impatient, it wasn't even simply worried. It was the unguarded face of someone who loved something very much, and was terrified every day of what that meant. Nora looked at her father, and then looked at the place where the bread had been, and then back at her father, and then she got to her feet carefully and padded out past him without a word. He watched her go, then he looked at Clara. "She hasn't spoken since September," he said. It came out like something he hadn't meant to say. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said the true thing instead. "She came in because she smelled the bread. That's real." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not what Colton expected." "No," she agreed, "I gather that." He almost smiled. It was the ghost of one something that started and then thought better of itself. "Kitchen looks different. It needed attention." "Colton said you did the shelves." They were coming off the wall. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. Not at her at the kitchen she'd rebuilt in a day, the stove that was actually doing its job, the clean work table, the dough rising in the bowls she'd found at the back of a cupboard and scrubbed until they were right. "Position's yours," he said, "if you want it." She had been holding her breath without realizing it. She let it out. "Yes," she said, "I want it." He nodded once and left before she could say anything else. She heard his step in the hall and then on the stairs, measured and deliberate, a man going back to a life that had more weight in it than most. She stood in the kitchen she'd just been given and put her hands back in the dough. Outside, the sky was starting to go from black to the deep gray that came just before dawn, and the stove was burning steady, and the sourdough starter was sitting on the shelf in its jar, alive, fed, still going. She had nowhere to be that wasn't here. She pressed her palms into the dough and shaped it and let the rhythm do what it always did, which was make the inside of her skull quiet enough to think in. She had a kitchen. She had a job. She had, somewhere behind her in the gray Montana morning, 9 days of train and 12 hours of work, and a night of sleep on a cot that had been one of the better nights she'd had in 3 years. She also had a man in Chicago who would eventually realize she hadn't simply gone for a walk, who would ask questions, who would find the post office, the false name, the trail she'd tried to cover but had never been as invisible as she'd hoped. She pressed the dough flat and folded it over and pressed it again. For right now, just right now, she was the woman who made the bread. That was enough. That was actually genuinely enough. The dawn came up slow and cold outside the kitchen window, and the rolls rose in their pans, and Clara Bennett worked through the last quiet hour before the ranch woke up, and for the first time in 3 years she felt the floor solid under her feet. The rolls were gone by 6:30 in the morning. Clara had made 3 dozen, which she'd thought was more than enough for a ranch bunkhouse, and she'd thought wrong. She heard them go, the particular sound of men who'd been eating whatever was fastest and cheapest, discovering that someone had put real effort into their breakfast. There was no fanfare about it. Ranch hands didn't give speeches over food. But she heard the scrape of the pan being checked twice, and the pause before someone said something low to someone else, and the silence that followed, which was the particular silence of a room where everyone is chewing, and no one wants to stop to talk. She was already making the next batch when Colton came in for his coffee. He poured it himself from the pot she'd kept on the stove, which was not something she'd explicitly invited, but also not something she planned to fight over, and stood near the window drinking it, and watching her work with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of grudging recalibration. "You need to tell me what you need in here," he said finally. "Stores, supplies, what's missing? I made a list last night." He put his hand out. She gave him the paper she'd left on the shelf, 2 pages, front and back, written in the small, precise hand she'd developed from years of keeping kitchen inventory. He looked at it. His eyebrows moved upward by a fraction of an inch. "That's thorough," he said. "The molasses is almost out. The baking powder's been open so long it's probably half dead. There's no salt pork at all, which means whoever was handling food stores before wasn't planning more than a week ahead, and the flour bin is going to be empty by Thursday if I keep breakfast volume at yesterday's level." She folded another roll without looking up. "I tried to note which things are immediate and which can wait a week." Colton looked at the list again. "How do you know the baking powder's bad?" "I tested it in hot water this morning. It barely reacted." He made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll go into town Wednesday. If you could prioritize the salt and the fresh lard, I can make the rest work until then." He looked at her for a moment. "You've run a kitchen before. Since I was 17. He didn't say anything to that. He drank the rest of his coffee, set the cup on the table, and walked out. She was learning how Colton expressed most things through the quality of his departures. She went back to her rolls and tried not to think too hard about the fact that she was already planning Wednesday, as if Wednesday was certain, as if this kitchen was already hers in a way that went beyond the word position that Wyatt had used that morning. She told herself it was just planning, practical thinking, the kind that kept a kitchen running. She didn't entirely believe herself, but the dough needed shaping, and the stove needed watching, and there was enough to do that. Believing herself wasn't required. The weeks that followed were not easy, and anyone who told the story later and made them sound easy was leaving out most of it. The cold was the first thing. Clara had grown up in Chicago winters and thought she understood cold, but Montana in January was a different category. Entirely, it was cold with conviction. Cold that meant something. Cold that pushed against every seal in the building and found the ones that weren't quite right. The kitchen was the warmest room in the main house by virtue of the stove, but even so she worked most mornings in 2 layers until the firebox had been going an hour, and her hands cracked at the knuckles in the dry air until she learned to keep lard nearby and work it in during any spare moment. The physical work was the second thing. She'd worked hard at the bakery, but this was different in scope and relentlessness. Breakfast for 14 men, because that was the number Colton gave her, including the hands who rotated through, then the midday meal, then the evening meal, plus whatever baking she could work in around the edges for the following day, plus the cleaning and the supply management and the ongoing repair of a kitchen that had been neglected into a state of structural resentment. The stove had a temperamental draft. 2 of the burner grates sat unevenly and had to be coaxed. The water supply to the kitchen from the main well required a particular sequence of actions in cold weather that no one had written down, and she'd had to figure out by getting it wrong twice. The men were the third thing, not hostile, mostly more like a collective that had decided to withhold judgment until the evidence was in. They ate her food, they said little. They had developed, over years of bunkhouse life, an entire vocabulary of nonverbal communication that she was reading from the outside, and largely having to interpret from context. The one who'd come to the kitchen first, she learned, was called Denny Hollis, and he was 23 years old and had never in his life, apparently, eaten bread made from anything other than commercial yeast, and he experienced the sourdough as a kind of personal revelation he was embarrassed about, and therefore covered by eating it extremely fast every morning. The fourth thing, and the one she thought about most late at night when she was too tired to do anything but lie on the cot and stare at the ceiling, was the feeling that any of this could be taken away. Not by anything dramatic, she wasn't naive enough to think dramatic was always how it happened, but by a letter from Chicago, by a telegram, by Wyatt Mercer deciding she was more trouble than the food was worth, by the 10,000 ordinary ways that things that seemed stable turned out not to be. She kept working. She didn't know another answer. It was in the 4th week that she first understood what Ironridge was actually dealing with. She'd found the ledger by accident. She'd been looking for a larger pot, she'd been told, was stored in the back room off the kitchen, and the ledger was on the shelf above where the pot turned out not to be. She'd have left it alone except that it fell when she pulled down the pot from the wrong shelf, and pages fell open, and she was constitutionally unable to close a book without her eyes reading the page in front of her. What she read gave her a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature. She put the ledger back and found her pot, and went back to the kitchen and spent 3 days thinking about what she'd seen before she said anything. She was not someone who made fast conclusions from partial information. That much she'd learned in Chicago, where partial information had been the primary medium Victor operated in. So she watched and listened, and paid attention to things she'd been paying attention to anyway. She noticed that the ranch hands were getting paid in staggered amounts that didn't match the weeks they'd worked. She noticed that Colton sometimes went to town with a tightness around his jaw that wasn't there when he left for supplies, and came back with it still there. She noticed that Wyatt, who came through the kitchen some mornings early enough to catch the first round of coffee, had developed the habit of standing at the window for a few minutes before he said anything, looking out at the yard with an expression that wasn't morning quiet, but rather the look of a man calculating something he wasn't happy about. She asked Denny Hollis about Silas Calder, casually, over a biscuit she'd made specifically, because she'd noticed it was the one food Denny consumed slowly enough to talk around. Denny's face changed in the way young men's faces changed when they encountered a subject they'd been told not to discuss. "What about him?" he said. "Just heard the name," she said. "Didn't know who he was." Denny chewed his biscuit. "He runs the Double C North and East, big operation. Been here longer than Ironridge." A pause. "Him and Mr. Mercer don't get along. Why not?" Another pause, longer this time. "So, water," he said finally, and applied himself to the biscuit with renewed focus. Water. In a cattle operation, water was almost everything: access to river water for cattle, rights to it, the question of who controlled which feed and which land between operations. She'd grown up in a city and she understood water at the level of pipes and bills, but she was learning fast out here that it was something else, entirely a resource that men organized their entire existences around, that whole conflicts grew from, that people in this part of the country had been fighting over in one form or another, for as long as there'd been cattle to water. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the numbers she'd seen in the cattle columns, the ones that didn't add up to the contract figures she'd glimpsed in the correspondence Colton sometimes brought to the kitchen table to read through over coffee. She thought about how a large operation like Ironridge could be in financial trouble without being visibly failing, about how trouble often worked from the inside out quiet, so the surface still looked solid until it didn't. She went back to the ledger that evening after the kitchen was clean and the hands were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. She sat at the kitchen table with it and a lamp and went through every page with the focus she'd once applied to the bakery's books, when the owner was getting sick and had stopped watching the numbers carefully. She was up until 2 in the morning. What she found was not fraud, exactly or not obviously. It was more like erosion. Cattle losses over the previous 8 months that were slightly higher than they should have been given the conditions, not catastrophically high, but consistently, persistently higher. Supply costs that had crept upward in amounts small enough to look like inflation, but which, when she mapped them across suppliers, showed a pattern of price increases from 2 specific vendors that wasn't mirrored anywhere else in the market. And then the loans, 3 of them, taken in the previous 6 months from the same bank in Helena, at rates that were a full 1.5 above what the operation's land value should have supported. She closed the ledger and sat very still in the kitchen for a while. She wasn't certain. She knew that. She was a baker and a kitchen manager, not a ranch accountant, and the specifics of cattle operations were not her area. But she had spent 2 years watching Victor manipulate money, watching him make numbers tell stories that weren't true, watching him arrange figures so that the problem was always somewhere just out of sight, and she recognized the shape of it, even if she couldn't name every specific. She put the ledger back. She made a list of her own questions on a separate piece of paper and folded it and put it in her coat pocket, and thought very carefully about what to do with it. She approached Wyatt on a Sunday morning, which was the morning when the ranch ran on reduced schedule, and there was sometimes a pocket of quiet after the early work before the midday demands. She'd seen him go to the small room off the main hallway, not an office exactly, more like a room that had become an office through accumulation, and she gave it 20 minutes before she knocked. He looked up from the papers on the desk with the expression of someone who'd been so deep in something unpleasant that they'd stopped registering their own face. "Miss Bennett." "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, and she meant it. And then she said the thing anyway because she hadn't come this far by waiting for better timing. "I looked at the ledger, the one in the storeroom." A long pause. "That ledger is private property." It fell off a shelf. "I put it back, but I saw enough." She stayed in the doorway. "I'm not asking to insert myself into your business. I'm telling you because I think what I saw matters." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. Then he said, "Close the door." She did. She sat across the desk from him and told him precisely what she'd seen: the cattle numbers, the supply costs, the loan rates. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't speculate beyond what the figures showed. She presented it the way she would have presented any kitchen inventory. "Here is what the numbers say. Here is what I find unusual. Here is what I don't know." When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "The bank in Helena," he said finally. "The loan rates concern me most," she said. "At the rate they're compounding, and given what the cattle figures suggest about income over the next quarter, we'd be in default by fall. Possibly earlier if this winter's losses are on the high end of what the pattern suggests." He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. It was not the look of a man hearing this for the first time. It was the look of a man hearing out loud something he'd been carrying alone. "Calder's been working the bank," he said. "I couldn't prove it. The rates didn't make sense, but the documentation was all in order and I didn't—" He stopped. "I have been trying to figure out how to address 4 problems at once without the money to address one of them." Clara thought about this. "Your supply contracts," she said. "Are they locked in?" "Cattle contracts, yes, through the end of the year." "Not those, the other direction, what you're buying. The vendors you're using." He frowned slightly. "Colton handles procurement." "I know. And I think 2 of the vendors he's using have been adjusting prices in ways that don't track with market rates. I don't know if that's Calder's doing or just opportunism. But either way, you're paying more than you should." He was quiet again, looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, some combination of the wariness she recognized from their first morning and something else, something that was deciding whether to let her farther in. "What would you do?" he said. "About which part?" "Any of it." She thought about it honestly before she answered. "The supply side I can help with directly. I've been running a kitchen budget for 4 weeks, and I know what things should cost. I can go through the procurement records and show you exactly where the discrepancy is. That's not going to fix the bank situation, but it will stop some of the bleeding." She paused. "The bread," he blinked. "What about it?" "Denny told me the railroad camp is about 60 miles northeast. Are they being supplied?" "They have a general arrangement with a store in Millhaven." "Is it under contract?" A pause, not a formal one. "Then it could be renegotiated." She let that sit for a moment. "I can produce bread at scale. If I have the right equipment and supplies, which I've already identified, I can supply a camp of that size with daily bread. It would require a contract that covers the supplies and my time, but the margin above cost would be real income for the ranch." Wyatt looked at her. "I am aware that I've been here less than a month," she said. "Yes," he said, "you have. And I know this is not what you hired me to do." "Also, yes," she looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you what I can see. What you do with it is your call. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think she'd miscalculated, pushed too fast, overstepped in a way that would cost her the ground she'd made. She had done this before in Chicago, moved too quickly and had it turned against her, and the memory of that put a careful chill behind her ribs. But he nodded. "Show me the procurement records," he said, "and write me a proposal for the railroad contract. Something I can actually take to them. I'll have it by Tuesday." She stood. He stood too, which was the kind of automatic courtesy that came from a particular background, and said things about a person without trying to. He looked like he was about to say something and then reconsidered it. "Why?" he said, instead. Just the one word. She thought about the true answer, which was complicated, and gave him the part of it that was cleanest. "Because the kitchen runs better when the ranch is stable," she said. "And I'd like to stay in the kitchen." He almost did the ghost of the smile again. "Tuesday," he said. She had the proposal done by Monday. It was not a small document. She'd sat at the kitchen table after the evening meal, with the lamp burning low and the house quiet around her, and written it the way she wrote everything important precisely, without flourish, with the numbers visible and the reasoning clear and the uncertainties named rather than hidden. She included 3 pricing scenarios based on ingredient cost variations she'd tracked over her first 4 weeks. She included a production schedule that accounted for the kitchen's current capacity and what it would require to expand. She included a note on what the sourdough starter contributed to shelf life that bread made this way, properly wrapped, stayed good for 5 days rather than 2, which mattered enormously for a camp 60 miles away that couldn't take daily deliveries. She also, because it had been forming in her mind for a week, included a separate page on what she was calling a stake arrangement. The idea was simple, and the kind of thing that made obvious sense once you saw it. If the ranch hands had a small ownership stake in the bread operation, not in Ironridge itself, but in this specific enterprise, they had a reason to help it succeed, to make deliveries when needed, to tell people in town and at the camp about the bread, to invest their reputation in it. The stake could be structured as a share of profit rather than wages, which cost ranch nothing in advance and rewarded performance. She'd seen something similar once in a piece of business writing she'd read years ago and had never forgotten it, because it was the kind of idea that felt fair in a way most business ideas didn't. She left the proposal on Wyatt's desk Sunday night and went to bed. Tuesday morning, Colton came into the kitchen with a look she hadn't seen on his face before, something that had shifted from his baseline skepticism toward something more uncomfortable, which in Colton's case meant uncomfortable with being wrong. "How'd you know about Vickers Supply?" he said. "Their prices are 12% higher than Bellman's for equivalent product. Bellman's is farther. Bellman's will deliver for 8% less than the difference. I wrote to them last week." Colton stared at her. "You wrote to them?" "I had a paper, a pen, and a legitimate reason." She turned back to the stove. "I hope that's all right." There was a silence that she let sit. "That's gonna say—" He stopped. He was doing the math in his head. She could tell the kind of math that had implications he hadn't finished working through yet. "That's not a small number." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He put his coffee cup down on the table, which he usually didn't. He stood there for a moment with his arms crossed and his jaw working on something he didn't know how to say, and she gave him time with it, because some things needed time. "You're going to be a problem," he said finally. She looked at him. For who? He was quiet for another moment, then, "Not quite, but almost. Not for us." It was the nearest thing to welcome she'd gotten from Colton Rusk, and she understood it as such and didn't push it further. The railroad camp contract took 3 weeks to negotiate, and during those 3 weeks she learned several things she hadn't known about Wyatt Mercer. He was a poor negotiator. This was not an insult, it was just true, in the specific way that men who'd built their power on physical presence and land command sometimes struggled in the back and forth of paper negotiation, where the advantage went to whoever was most comfortable with silence and most willing to look at numbers without flinching. He kept wanting to close the deal before the other side had been made appropriately uncomfortable with the alternative, which was the moment you needed to hold for. He knew he was a poor negotiator, which was the important part. "You should come," he said, after the first round of letters produced terms that were below what she'd projected. She looked at him. "To negotiate a bread contract. To sit across from them while I talk and tell me with your eyes if I'm about to make a mistake. That's a peculiar use of a kitchen manager." "Probably," he said. "You coming?" She came. The man from the railroad camp was named Forsyth, and he was the kind of man who made quick assessments of everyone in the room, and then proceeded as if those assessments were final. He looked at Clara, made his assessment, and redirected his attention to Wyatt. She sat across the table and ate the bread she'd brought as a sample, and watched Forsyth negotiate and waited. Wyatt was presenting the pricing structure. Forsyth was making noises about the distance, the logistics, the adequacy of their current supply arrangement. Clara watched and said nothing. When Wyatt paused, she picked up the remaining bread from the sample plate and said, without looking at Forsyth, "How long does your current bread last?" Forsyth blinked. "Pardon?" After delivery, before it goes off. He looked at her for the first time as if she might be a participant rather than furniture. "Day and a half, maybe 2. Ours runs 5 days. I can show you the test records if you want to see them." She set the bread down. "That changes your per unit cost calculation. You're buying more frequently to compensate for spoilage. If we supply every 5 days instead of every 2, your logistics cost drops." She picked up her coffee cup, "But you've probably already figured that out." She had correctly guessed that he had not figured that out yet, and she watched him figure it out now, and she watched his expression shift by a small but significant degree. They got the contract at her middle-range pricing. Not the top, she hadn't expected the top, but well above what Wyatt had been about to accept. On the ride back, Wyatt was quiet for a mile and a half. Then he said, "You told him he'd figured it out. People negotiate better when they think they're the smart one. Is that something you learned? Or something you worked out?" She thought about Victor's tactics, the way he'd always made her feel, like she was the one who'd come to the obvious conclusion, rather than the one being steered toward it. "Both," she said. He accepted that without further question, which was something she noticed about him. He didn't push on the edges of things she didn't explain fully. She wasn't sure yet whether that was respect or disinterest, but it felt cautiously like the former. March came in cold and reluctant, and the bread operation expanded into it. She had worked out a production schedule that required her to start the overnight ferment by 4 in the afternoon, which meant restructuring the kitchen's whole rhythm, which meant telling Colton she needed the storeroom reorganized to accommodate the fermentation vessels, which led to a 45-minute conversation that was technically an argument, but functioned more like a negotiation between two people who were both right about different things and knew it. She got to the storeroom. Colton got to redesign the shelving arrangement, which he did with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent 40 years knowing exactly where everything should be. The first delivery went out on a Tuesday, loaded into the ranch wagon with blankets to hold the temperature, and came back with an empty wagon, and a signed receipt and a note from Forsyth that said same quantity next week. She read the note twice and then set it on the shelf next to the sourdough starter and went back to the evening meal. Denny Hollis had been the one to make the delivery. He came back walking slightly differently than he'd left, with the gait of a person who'd done something that mattered and knew it. He didn't say anything about it directly. He ate his supper and helped carry plates without being asked, which he'd never done before, and she understood. She put through the steak arrangement proposal the next week. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table over coffee while she worked, which was becoming a pattern, him finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the early morning, her finding that she didn't mind, that the sound of another person in the room didn't have the quality it had once had, the quality of someone monitoring. He set the proposal down and said, "Who taught you to think about money like this?" "No one," she said. "I taught myself. When you're managing something on a tight margin, you either learn to see the numbers or you fail." He looked at the proposal. "The bakery you worked at, it was going to go under. The owner wasn't watching. I started watching. Did it go under?" She flipped a loaf out of the pan and set it to cool. "Not while I was there." He approved the steak arrangement. The ranch hands didn't know what to do with it at first. 3 of them asked Colton what the catch was, and Colton, to his credit, told them there wasn't one that he could see. It took 2 weeks for the shift to become visible. By the end of those 2 weeks, she had men volunteering to help load the delivery wagon who had never volunteered for anything that wasn't directly their job. And she heard Denny explaining the pricing structure to one of the newer hands with the confidence of a man who had a stake in something and wanted that known. It was in the middle of that 3rd week when she found Nora in the kitchen again. It was late afternoon, the kitchen at its quietest before the evening rush began, and the girl slipped in while Clara was working through the fermentation timing on the week's bread and sat at the end of the work table with the careful quietness of someone who'd been practicing not being noticed. Clara had learned, in the months since Nora's first visit, to let her arrive on her own terms. The girl came in twice a week on average, sometimes more, and had developed her own relationship with the kitchen that didn't seem to require Clara doing anything in particular except existing in it. She would sit and watch, or she would occupy herself with small things: a piece of dough Clara left within reach, a collection of dried herbs she'd organized into jars over the course of 3 separate visits, a system of categorizing the wooden spoons by length that Clara had discovered one morning and chosen to maintain. She had not spoken, not once in all those weeks, but the silence had changed quality. The first time she'd come in, the silence had been the silence of a small animal holding perfectly still. Now it was something else present, warm, the silence of a person comfortable enough not to need words. Claire was rolling dough for the next day's rolls when Nora, without warning, reached out and put her small hand over Clara's on the table. Not grabbing, not pulling, just there. The way a person reached toward warmth, Clara kept rolling. She didn't stop, didn't make a sound, didn't change anything about her face or her movement. She simply didn't pull away and let the girl's hand stay where it was and kept working. After about a minute, Nora took her hand back and went back to her spoon arrangement. Clara's throat did something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she swallowed it down and kept working, and the kitchen held the two of them in its warmth while the light went long and amber outside and the stove kept its steady heat. Wyatt found them like that, his daughter reorganizing the spoons, Clara shaping rolls, the two of them in the same room in the same specific quality of quiet, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before Clara was aware of him. When she looked up, his expression had the thing in it she'd seen before, on their first morning, the unguarded thing, the thing underneath the controlled surface. Only this time it was different. On that first morning, it had been grief, or close to grief. Now it was something that didn't have as clean a name. He looked at his daughter's back, at the focused way she was arranging those spoons, and then at Clara, and Clara looked back at him and felt something shift in the room in a way she wasn't ready to name. She ate, he said quietly, at the table, at dinner. She sat in her chair for the whole meal for the first time in months. Clara looked at him steadily. "I thought you should know," he said, as if that explained why he'd said it the way he had, softly, with his voice, doing things that voices did when they'd been carrying something alone for a long time, and found an unexpected place to set part of it down. "She knows where the kitchen is," Clara said. "The door's always open." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something had been settled that he didn't have words for, and went back into the hall. Clara turned back to her rolls. Her hands were steady. Everything else in her chest was considerably less so. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday morning in the last week of March. Colton brought it from town without saying what it was, set it on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup, and stood back with the particular stillness of someone who'd already read it and was waiting for the reaction. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. The name on the telegram was not Victor's. It was a name she didn't recognize, a law office in Chicago, formal language, the kind of phrasing that meant someone had paid a lawyer to find words that were threatening without being technically threatening. The substance of it was simple, that Clara Bennett was being sought by Mr. Victor Hale in connection with certain matters of a personal nature, and that her whereabouts had been identified, and that Mr. Hale would be arriving to discuss those matters in the coming weeks. She set the telegram down. The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread, and the stove was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And outside through the window, the yard was thawing at the edges where the sun hit it first. She had known. She had always known in the sensible part of herself that this was coming. You didn't walk away from Victor Hale with $11 in a carpetbag and expect him to stay in Chicago. You didn't hope your trail was cold enough. You built a life as fast as you could in whatever time you had, and you tried to be rooted enough that when he came, the roots held. She had maybe 3 weeks. She pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at the telegram and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the old version of the fear, the cold, shrinking, make yourself small version that had been her companion for 3 years in Chicago. She let it come up, and she felt the shape of it, and then she put it down. She picked up the telegram and took it to Wyatt's office and knocked. He read it once, and then again, and then he set it on the desk and looked at her with an expression that was very quiet and very deliberate. "You were running from him," he said, "not a question." "Yes, and he's coming here, it seems so." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me." She looked at him directly. "You hired me to run a kitchen. My past wasn't part of the arrangement." "It is now, I know." She kept her eyes on his. "I'm telling you now." He looked at her for a long time, not unkindly, but with the steadiness of a man sorting through what he knew and what he owed and what the right thing was in that order. Then he looked at the telegram. "Tell me about him," he said. She told him. Not everything, not the whole architecture of it, not the private textures, but enough. Enough that he understood what kind of man Victor Hale was, and what he would do when he arrived, and what his weapons were, and where he would aim them. Wyatt listened without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was still warm, and the bread was still rising in the pans, and outside the sun was working at the last of the snow in the yard, and none of that had changed. The ranch was still the ranch. The bread was still the bread. Nora was somewhere in the house, arranging something by some system that only made sense to her, and the hands were working the fence line she'd heard them discussing at breakfast, and the sourdough starter on the kitchen shelf was doing what it had done every day for 2 years, staying alive. "He'll expect to find you frightened," Wyatt said. "He usually does." "And what does he find instead?" Clara looked at him. There was an answer forming in her chest that was clearer and steadier than anything she'd felt in years. Not bravado, not performance, but the simple, settled truth of someone who had spent 4 months building something real. "He finds me here," she said. Wyatt nodded. He looked at the telegram one more time. Then he picked it up, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket, and Clara understood that as the gesture it was that whatever was coming, he was not turning away from it. Outside, the last of the March snow gave way to mud and the slow, stubborn return of something green, and the bread on the shelf rose in its pans, and Ironridge Ranch went on about its day. Victor Hale arrived on a Thursday. Clara knew he was coming before she saw him. She heard the horses first, 2 of them, and the particular sound of a hired rig rather than a working ranch horse, the kind of deliberate pace that said the man riding in it had never needed to hurry because the world rearranged itself ahead of him. She was in the kitchen. She stayed there. She kept her hands in the bread she was shaping, and she breathed the way she'd been practicing slow, from the bottom of the lungs, the way that kept the chest from tightening into the old knot. She heard Colton's voice in the yard, brief, flat, the tone he used when he was not pleased with what he was looking at. Then another voice, smooth, pitched to carry, the voice of a man who understood the way. Sound moved in a space and had spent years using it to fill rooms before he walked through the doors. She pressed her palms into the dough and shaped it, and did not go to the window. Wyatt had known he was coming. She'd told him everything the telegram implied, and Wyatt had spent the 2 weeks since then doing things she'd observed but not been privy to in full. Conversations with Colton that stopped when she came near, not from secrecy but from the particular focused quiet of men planning something practical. A letter he'd written and sent that she hadn't asked about. A visit to Millhaven that had lasted longer than a supply run usually did. She'd told him she didn't need managing. "I know that," he'd said. "This isn't about managing you." She'd accepted that, because it was true in the way he'd meant it, even if the shape of it still made something in her chest draw back from old habit. She heard boots on the porch steps. The kitchen door opened, and it was Colton, not Victor, and she let out the breath she'd been holding without making a sound. "He's asking for the house," Colton said. He would be. Wyatt said to bring him to the front room. Colton's jaw was doing the thing it did when he was containing something. "Said to tell you you don't have to be in there." "I know." She divided the dough and set the pieces to rest. "Tell Wyatt I'll be in 10 minutes. Colton looked at her for a moment. "You sure?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the kind of statement Colton made when he was offering something without knowing how to offer it, directly a little awkward, a little gruff, entirely sincere. She'd learned to read him, in the months since January, the way you learn to read weather, not from what was visible on the surface, but from the small shifts that meant something was building beneath. "I'm sure," she said. He left. She washed her hands. She took off her apron, folded it, and set it on the shelf next to the sourdough starter, which was doing what it always did, patient and alive. She looked at the kitchen for a moment, the clean stove, the organized shelves, the fermentation crocks lined up along the back wall, the whole functioning, breathing, productive space she'd built in 4 months from nothing but a ruined room and her own stubborn insistence on work. Then she walked into the front room. Victor looked exactly like himself, which was the most disorienting thing about him. She had spent months constructing a version of him in her memory that was bigger, somehow more monstrous in proportion, which was what fear did to people you were afraid of. The reality of him standing in Wyatt Mercer's front room was that he was just a man. 43 now, well-dressed in the specific way that was designed to read as understated wealth, with the careful posture and the managed expression, and the eyes that were always doing something different from the face around them. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression did the thing she remembered, the subtle arrangement of features into warmth, into concern, into the presentation of a man who had been worried about someone he cared for. "Clarice," he said, like he was relieved. She crossed the room and stood beside the fireplace and did not say anything. Wyatt was in the chair to her left, not standing. Deliberately, she understood, because standing would have made the whole thing feel more like a confrontation than a conversation, and he'd chosen the posture of a man in his own house who saw no reason to be anything other than settled. He had a coffee cup on the side table. He looked like he'd been sitting there all morning. Victor shifted his attention to Wyatt with the calibrated grace of someone changing conversational channels. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me. I hope my arrival isn't an inconvenience." "Not particularly," Wyatt said. "I won't take up much of your time." Victor's voice was everything it had always been: warm, reasonable, the voice of a man who was only being logical, only being sensible, only trying to help. "I've been concerned about Clara. She left Chicago under difficult circumstances, and I've been trying to ensure she's safe and well cared for." "She looks well cared for to me," Wyatt said. A small pause. Victor's expression adjusted by a fraction, "Of course. I can see she's been productive here." He looked at Clara. "You always were good in a kitchen." She knew what that was. She'd heard it before, Phrased different ways, the compliment that was also a diminishment, the acknowledgement that was also a box. You're good at this small thing. Stay in it. She'd spent 3 years learning the grammar of it. Why are you here, Victor? She said, not a question. I told you I was worried. No. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her, and she surprised him too, by the small shift behind his eyes. You're here because you don't accept that I left. You're here because you've decided that my leaving is a problem you're going to solve. She kept her eyes on his. I'm not going back to Chicago. Victor looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating. She could see it happening, the shift from the warmth and concern register to something that had more edges in it, though he kept it contained because he was always contained, always managed, always knowing that the open version of himself was a weapon he only used when there was no one watching. Clary said gentler, turning up the concern, you left without any resources, without any plan. She had a plan, Wyatt said from the chair, quiet, not aggressive, just factual. Victor looked at him. She wrote a letter, applied for a position, traveled here, and has been running the kitchen and the bread operation for Ironridge Ranch for 4 months. Wyatt picked up his coffee cup. That sounds like a plan to me, with respect, Mr. Mercer. You don't know the full situation. Then tell me the full situation. A pause. Victor straightened slightly, not visibly, just the internal adjustment of a man who'd expected different terrain and was reconfiguring his approach. He was good at it. She'd watched him do it hundreds of times in Chicago drawing rooms, at dinner tables, in the offices of men he needed something from. Clara has struggled, he said. Since her mother's death, she's had difficulty with decisions, with judgment. I've been trying to support her, but she's always found that difficult to accept. She has a tendency to interpret concern as control. Clara heard the words and felt the old sensation, the slight dizzying quality of being told that what she'd experienced hadn't been what she'd experienced, the ground shifting just slightly underfoot. She had felt it so many times in Chicago that her body had learned to produce the sensation at the sound of his voice. She breathed. She felt the floor under her feet, solid, wooden Montana floor. In a house she'd cooked in for 4 months, beside a fireplace, she'd cleaned the flue on herself because it was drawing wrong. She was here. This was real. I interpret control as control, she said. I'm not confused about the difference. Victor looked at her with something that was almost surprise. Almost, I think, Wyatt said, setting down his cup, that Clara has been pretty clear about what she wants. She's employed here. She's free to make her own decisions. He looked at Victor directly. That's the full situation. Victor was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she recognized. She'd seen it in Chicago, in the moments when a conversation wasn't going the way he'd mapped it out, when the person he was talking to wasn't responding to the frame he'd constructed. A tightening, small and controlled, and then the next approach being assembled behind the eyes. I have some concerns about Ironridge, he said. His voice was still pleasant. Financially. I have connections with several banking institutions that do business in Helena, and I understand the ranch has had some difficulties recently. The room went still. Clara looked at him. That's a peculiar thing to bring up, Wyatt said, and his voice had not changed its register, still quiet, still settled, but there was something underneath it now. I'm simply saying that Montana is a difficult environment for a woman on her own, particularly if the enterprise she's attached herself to isn't on solid ground. Victor spread his hands in the gesture she hated most, the one that meant I'm only being reasonable. I could offer Clara a much more secure situation. She has a secure situation, Wyatt said, with respect. You've said that phrase 3 times, Wyatt said, and each time you've said something that wasn't respectful. So let me be direct with you. He stood up, which he'd been deliberately not doing, and the quality of the room changed. Wyatt Mercer was not a small man, and when he chose to take up the space he occupied it completely. Clara is employed here. She's here by her own choice, and she'll leave by her own choice. You've made your case, she's answered it. I think we're done. Victor looked at him with the expression that Clara had only seen a handful of times, the one that came, when the social surface cracked just slightly, when the pleasant, reasonable man ran up against something he couldn't immediately maneuver around. It wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to a cold, assessing fury held very still. I hope you understand what you're involving yourself in, Victor said. I have a fair idea, Wyatt said. Colton will walk you back to your rig. Victor looked at Clara one more time. She met his eyes and held them, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, because this wasn't over and she knew it, but a kind of firm, planted certainty, the certainty of someone who has both feet on ground that belongs to them. This isn't finished, Clara, he said quietly. Just for her. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He left. She heard his boots on the porch, Colton's footsteps behind him, the rig pulling away from the yard. She stood by the fireplace and breathed and didn't move until the sound was gone. Wyatt didn't say anything immediately. He sat back down and looked at the fire. and she stood by the wall, and they were both quiet for a little while, which she was grateful for. "He's going to come at the bank," she said finally. "I know." He wasn't bluffing about the connections. "He has them, so do I." He looked at the fire, fewer maybe, but some. She crossed to the chair across from him and sat. Her legs were shakier than she'd have preferred, but she was sitting now and it didn't show. "He'll try to find something else to use. He's methodical. He'll go through everything connected to Ironridge until he finds a pressure point. Let him look. The procurement records are clean now. The railroad contract is solid. He'll find something. He always finds something." She looked at Wyatt steadily. "I need you to understand that. Not to frighten you out of this just because you need the full picture. He doesn't lose when he decides he's not going to lose. Keeps adjusting the approach." "So do we," Wyatt said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the particular expression she'd come to recognize as his version of settled, not comfortable, not easy, but committed, the way a post was committed to the ground it was driven into. "I'm going to find out more about his business dealings," she said, "in Chicago. If he's done this before, and I think he has, I think I wasn't the first, then there's a record of it somewhere. And if there's a record, then there are other women." He was quiet for a moment. "That would time."
Yes.
She folded her hands in her lap. "I have time. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a moment, and the expression did what it did the complicated thing, the thing she was still learning the grammar of. Then he looked back at the fire. "The hands were asking about you," he said, which was apparently a different subject. "After the rig pulled in, Denny came to me directly. Said he wanted to know if there was going to be a problem." She blinked. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask Colton." A pause. "Colton told him that if there was a problem, the hands could decide for themselves what they wanted to do about it." She didn't say anything. "3 of them were already in the yard when Victor walked back to his rig," Wyatt said, "not blocking it, just in the yard." She understood what that meant. She pressed her lips together and looked at the fire and let it mean what it meant without trying to manage the feeling it produced. "They're invested," she said. Her voice came out a little unsteady, which she hadn't planned. "They're invested," he agreed. In the days that followed Victor's visit, Ironridge settled back into its rhythm in the way that ranches did, not because the threat was gone, but because the work was always there, and the work didn't wait. The bread operation ran. The fermentation crocks held their timings. The delivery to the railroad camp went out on Tuesday and came back with Denny walking taller, and a note from Forsyth asking if they could increase the order by 30% for the following month. She said yes. She recalculated the schedule that same evening, worked out the additional supply requirements, and had the revised production plan ready for Colton by morning. He looked at it, made one adjustment she acknowledged was correct, and went to write the supply order. She was good at this, not in the way that people said things were going well, but in the specific, concrete, measurable sense that the numbers worked, and the bread was right, and the operation was functioning the way functioning things functioned. She held on to that. She held on to the fact of the stove burning clean, and the starter rising in its jar, and the ledger columns that were, for the first time in Ironridge's recent history, moving in the right direction. But she also watched the road. She watched it every morning when she went to the yard for wood, and every evening when the light went long across the mountains. And she watched it the way you watched something when you knew something was coming, but didn't know which direction it would arrive from. Victor didn't come back. Not in person. But 3 weeks after his visit, the bank in Helena sent a letter. Colton brought it from town with the same expression he'd had the first time, and she read it standing at the kitchen table. The terms of Ironridge's outstanding loans were being reviewed, the letter said. Given recent assessments of the collateral's value and the current market conditions in Montana Territory, the bank was initiating a preliminary review of the loan agreements, effective immediately. The ranch would be required to provide documentation of current income and operational expenses within 30 days. It was precise. It was carefully worded. It was the kind of letter that a man with bank connections could arrange if he was willing to use them. She set the letter on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "How bad?" she said. Colton poured his coffee. "Depends what the review finds." "What will it find?" He was quiet for a moment. 30 days ago? Not enough. Now. He looked at her. "The railroad contract changes things. The procurement savings. The profit margin on the bread." Another pause. "It's closer than it was, but not there yet." "Not yet." She picked up the letter and took it to Wyatt. What happened in the next 2 weeks was not one thing but many things happening at once, which was how real trouble always worked, not in a single wave, but in a series of smaller pressures that accumulated until the structure either held or didn't. The bank review proceeded. Wyatt retained a lawyer from Billings, a man named Hartley, dry and methodical, who arrived on a Monday and spent 2 days going through the ranch's financial records with the focus of someone who found numbers genuinely more interesting than people. He told Wyatt the documentation was messy but defensible, that the railroad contract was the most important single document in the file, and that they should expect the bank to push back regardless, because that was what banks with external pressure applied to them did. Clara stayed out of the legal part. That wasn't her terrain, and she knew it. What she did was generate documentation clear, organized records of the bread operation's income and expenses for every week since the railroad contract began, with projections forward that were conservative enough to be credible and accurate enough to matter. She gave them to Hartley without being asked. He looked at them for a long moment and then looked at her and said, "Did you train as an accountant?" "No," she said. "What did you train as a baker?" He looked at the documents again. "These are better than most of what I receive from men who trained as accountants." She went back to the kitchen and made sure the stove was at the right temperature. The second pressure came from a different direction. One of the smaller supply vendors in Millhaven, a man named Gerald Teague, who supplied some of the grain Clara used for the bread, told Denny Hollis during the Tuesday delivery that he'd had a visit from a man he didn't name, asking about the ranch's operation, and specifically about Clara's role in it. He'd told the man nothing, Teague said, but he'd wanted Ironridge to know. Clara heard this from Denny, who told her in the kitchen on Tuesday evening with the direct, slightly clumsy sincerity of a young man who decided this was information that mattered and had no idea how to deliver it elegantly. "He asked about you specifically," she said. "That's what Teague said. Your name, what you did here, how long you'd been around." She thought about this. Did Teague describe the man? Denny did. The description matched a type she recognized, not Victor himself, but the kind of man Victor hired when he needed information gathered from people who wouldn't give it to someone who looked like Victor. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me. Is there something we should do?" She looked at him, this 23-year-old who'd eaten her bread, and decided that gave him a stake, who'd started arriving early to load the delivery wagon and staying late to clean the fermentation crocks without being asked, who'd walked 3 inches taller every week since the railroad contract, and who was now standing in her kitchen asking if there was something they should do. "Keep doing the work," she said. "Don't change anything. Don't avoid Teague or any of the other vendors." She paused. "If anyone else has a similar visit, I want to know." "Sure," he said, and then awkwardly, "He's going to keep coming at you." "Yes." "What do you do with that?" She thought about the honest answer. "You document everything. You keep doing the work, and you don't give him anything he can use." She looked at Denny steadily. "The best thing I can do for Ironridge right now is make sure the operation runs clean and the numbers are real. That's what I'm doing." He nodded with the expression of someone filing something away. The third pressure came from a direction she hadn't expected, which in retrospect she should have. Nora disappeared. She was gone after lunch one Wednesday, not in any dramatic way, not in a way that initially alarmed anyone, because Nora was a quiet child who moved through the ranch on her own routes and had her own places she visited, and people had learned not to panic at her silences. But by mid-afternoon, when she wasn't in the kitchen and wasn't in her room, and wasn't in the barn where she sometimes watched the horses, the ranch began a slow escalation from awareness to concern. Clara found her. She found her because she'd been paying attention in the way she'd learned to pay attention to Nora, not watching directly, but tracking the peripheral things, the spoon arrangements and the small deposits of stones and dried flowers that appeared in the kitchen, and that always she'd referenced a place. The arrangement that morning had been near the kitchen's back window, which faced north. The only thing north of the main house that was specific to Nora was the small cedar tree at the edge of the fence line where Clara had once seen her go. Her mother's name was carved in the bark. She was there. She was sitting at the base of the tree with her knees pulled up, not crying, not moving, just present with something. The way a person sat with grief when grief was old enough to be quiet. Clara sat down beside her in the dead grass without saying anything, close but not touching, and let the silence be what it was. After a while, 15 minutes, maybe more, Nora said, without looking up, the man who came. Clara went very still. I heard him talking. Nora's voice was rusty with disuse, with months of chosen silence, but it was there small, careful, precise. "He said you were going to leave." "Did he say that to you?" "To the man in the yard. I was in the window." She looked at the bark of the tree. "Are you going to leave?" Clara thought about the weight of the answer, the true weight, not the comfortable weight, the one that acknowledged she didn't control everything, and that some of what happened next depended on things she couldn't fully see. She had spent too long around someone who gave comfortable answers when uncomfortable ones were called for. She wasn't going to start doing it herself. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I'm trying to make sure I don't have to." Nora was quiet for a moment. "But you might." "I don't think so. But I can't promise you things I can't control." She looked at the girl's profile, the dark hair, the serious jaw, the 6-year-old face carrying something much older behind it. What I can tell you is that whatever happens, I'm not leaving because I want to, and that's different. Nora considered this with the gravity of someone who had learned, the hard way, the distinction between people who left because they chose to and people who left because they had to. Her mother had been the second kind. She understood the categories in a way most 6-year-olds didn't have to, he said. They sat there a while longer, the two of them, while the afternoon light moved, and the mountains held their cold blue distance, and the cedar tree kept its bark-carved name. When they walked back to the house, Nora took Clara's hand about halfway across the yard. Clara held it without comment and kept walking, and that was that. Wyatt was in the yard when they came in. He saw them. Something crossed his face that he turned away from too quickly for her to read fully. And then he was asking Nora if she was hungry, and Nora was nodding, and it was just the ordinary machinery of an evening returning to itself. But his hand, when he passed Clara in the doorway, touched her arm. Brief, light, not quite accidental. She felt it for longer than the touch lasted. Colton found her 3 days later with the news that made everything else make a particular kind of sense. He came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning and put a piece of paper on the table beside her coffee cup and stood back with his arms crossed and waited for her to read it. It was a letter from a woman in Billings, whose name Clara didn't recognize, written in the careful hand of someone who'd spent time on the phrasing, making sure each sentence said exactly what she meant. The woman's name was Margaret Ellis. She wrote that she had heard, through a chain of people she described carefully, without naming directly, that there was a woman in Millhaven who had left Victor Hale in Chicago, and that she needed to speak with her. She had also, she wrote, left Victor Hale 4 years ago. She had spent those 4 years trying to document what he'd done to her, and finding that the documentation was never quite enough on its own, and that what she actually needed was to not be the only one saying it. Clara read the letter twice. She set it down. "How did this get here?" she said. "Hartley," Colton said. "The lawyer, he's been asking around." Quietly. He unfolded his arms. "Apparently he's found more than one." She looked at the letter again, the careful handwriting. The specific phrasing I needed to not be the only one saying it that she recognized from the inside, that she could have written herself in different words. She wasn't the first, she'd suspected it, but suspicion was one thing, and a letter in a stranger's handwriting on a table in Montana was another. "Does Wyatt know?" she said. "He's the one who told Hartley to ask." She looked out the kitchen window. The yard was ordinary, the hands beginning the morning's work, a horse being led from the barn, the mountains in the far distance holding their patient blue. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday. But something in the room had shifted in the way things shifted when a situation that had seemed bilateral turned out to have more dimensions than you'd seen. She picked up the letter and read it a third time. "I need to write back," she said. "Figured," Colton said. He took his coffee cup and left her to it. She sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen and thought about what to say to a woman who had left the same man she'd left, who had spent 4 years with documentation that wasn't enough on its own, who had known the way Clara was beginning to know that the only thing that made it enough was not being alone in it. She wrote, "My name is Clara Bennett. I'm in Millhaven, Montana. I've been here 4 months. I left Chicago in January. I believe you and I have more to tell each other than either of us can say in a letter. If you're willing, I'd like to find a way to talk." She sealed it and addressed it and gave it to Denny to take to town with the morning errands. Then she went back to the bread. The fermentation timing was precise, and the stove needed watching and the ranch needed feeding. And those things were true regardless of everything else. And she found, as she always found, that doing the work was the one reliable way she knew to keep the fear at a manageable size. The sourdough starter sat on the shelf in its jar and did what it had always done, fed and alive and continuing, through every mile and every season and every difficulty, to rise. It was Wyatt who told her, that same evening, what Hartley had said after reviewing the bank's position. They were in the kitchen, which was where they ended up most evenings now, not by design, or not by anything either of them had said aloud, but by the gravity of the room, the warmth of it, the fact that it was the room most associated with everything Ironridge was trying to become. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, and she was finishing the last of the evening's cleaning, and the house was quiet around them with Nora asleep upstairs. "Hartley thinks the bank will hold," he said. "The railroad contract income is the thing. It changes the calculation, I know," he also said, a pause. He turned the cup in his hands. He said that the quality of the financial documentation Clara provided made the difference in how confident he could be in the presentation. She wrung out the cloth and hung it and didn't say anything. "That's the second time someone said a version of that to me," he said. "I heard you the first time. I just wanted to—" He stopped. He looked at the cup. "I'm not good at this part." She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say and had no practice saying it, and for some reason that not the smooth version, not the managed version, but the struggling version, the version that was trying made something in her chest move. "You don't have to be good at it," she said. He looked up. "You could have run," he said, "when the telegram came or when he arrived. You could have left before he got here, and it would have been reasonable. Most people would have called it reasonable. I wasn't most people before I came here," she said. "I'm less so now." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind came off the mountains the way it always did in the evenings, and the house settled around them in the sounds old houses made, and the lamp on the table put everything in its particular amber. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "Simple, undecorated." She looked at him across the kitchen she'd built, in the house where his daughter had finally spoken again, with a letter from Margaret Ellis in her coat pocket, and a sourdough starter on the shelf, and a bread operation that was slowly, measurably pulling a ranch back from the edge. "So am I," she said. It wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't a resolution, and the things it was were still complicated and still uncertain, and still had the shape of things that hadn't been finished yet. But it was true in the clean, unembellished way that true things were true when you'd spent enough time around lies to know the difference. She put the lamp out and went to bed, and the kitchen sat in the dark and the starter kept its patient life on the shelf, and outside the Montana night held everything in its cold and enormous quiet, waiting for morning. Margaret Ellis arrived on a Tuesday, which was delivery day, which meant the ranch wagon was already hitched, and Denny was already in the yard when the stage from Billings pulled into Millhaven, and Clara was already behind on the morning's fermentation timing because she'd been too distracted to start it at the right hour. She knew she was distracted because she'd put salt in the wrong bowl twice and had to start a batch over, which she hadn't done since her first week in the kitchen. Colton had watched her do it the second time without comment, which was its own kind of comment. "Go to town," he said finally. "The bread? I'll watch the bread." She looked at him. "I know how to watch a stove," he said, with the tone of a man who found it mildly offensive to be doubted about this. "Go." She went. She rode into Millhaven with Denny, who had the social awareness to not ask questions, and the good sense to hum something low and tuneless for most of the ride, which was its own form of company. The stage was already in when they arrived, the horses being changed out in front of the post office, and 3 passengers were standing on the plank sidewalk with their bags. Clara recognized Margaret Ellis before she knew how she recognized her. It was an appearance she'd had no description. It was something else, some quality of the way the woman stood, the particular posture of someone who had learned to take up only as much space as strictly necessary, and was still working on unlearning it. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with a face that had probably been described as pretty before it had been described as tired, and she was scanning the street with the careful attention of someone who had spent time making sure she knew her exits. Their eyes met. Clara walked over. "Mrs. Ellis, Miss Bennett." The woman's voice was steady, with the steadiness that was something other than ease. "You look," she stopped, reconsidered. "You look like you belong here." "I'm starting to feel like it," Clara said. She picked up one end of the woman's bag. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." They talked for 3 hours in the kitchen while Colton made himself scarce, with the thoroughness of a man who understood that some conversations required the room to themselves. Denny came through once for the delivery manifest, took one look at the 2 women at the table and the particular quality of the air between them, and backed out without a word. Margaret had left Victor 4 years ago, which meant she'd been in his orbit before Clara had. She'd met him the same way Clara had, in the gradual, reasonable way, the way that didn't feel like anything was happening until something already was. She'd had money of her own then, a small inheritance from her father, and by the time she understood what was happening to it, much of it was gone, not stolen. Precisely, but arranged. Documents she'd signed that she hadn't fully understood. Accounts restructured in ways that required his name. The particular financial architecture of dependence, built brick by brick while she was looking somewhere else. She'd gotten out with the help of a cousin in Billings who'd asked the right questions at the right moment. She'd spent 4 years since then trying to reconstruct what had happened, trying to find the records, trying to find anyone who'd seen it, trying to build something that wasn't just her word against a well-dressed man with a lawyer on retainer who could make her sound confused and fragile and incapable of managing her own affairs. She talked about it the way people talked about things they'd practiced saying, but still hadn't made easy. Clara listened without interrupting, which was the most useful thing she could do, and recognized in every other sentence something she'd experienced in a different key. "He told people I was unstable," Margaret said, not bitterly, just as information. "Everyone who might have helped me, he got to them first, or most of them. By the time I tried to tell my version, they'd already heard his version, and his version was..." She looked at the table. His version was that he'd been very patient with a woman who had difficulty accepting help. I know that version, Clara said. Of course you do. Margaret looked up. How many of us are there, do you think? Clara didn't answer immediately, because she'd been asking herself the same question since Hartley had begun his quiet inquiries. What she'd heard back through the chain of people Hartley had been careful not to name directly suggested that the number was larger than 2. At least 4 that I'm aware of, she said. Probably more. Margaret was quiet for a moment. And you're going to fight him. I'm already fighting him. He's attacking the ranch's finances. Clara looked at her steadily. I'd rather attack his pattern. His lawyers are very good. I know. But lawyers work with what exists. If what exists is documentation and witnesses and a pattern that's repeated enough times to be undeniable, she stopped. Started again. He depends on each of us thinking we're alone. That's the foundation of everything he does. Remove that. And the whole thing looks different, Margaret said. Yes. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. She turned it in both hands the way people did when they were working up to something. I have documents, she said. I've been keeping them for 4 years. Account records, correspondence, a journal I kept at the time. She looked up. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew I wasn't going to let go of them. Clara felt something move in her chest, not excitement, exactly, but the specific feeling of a weight that had been carried alone and was starting to be distributed across more than one person. Can I see them? Margaret reached into her bag. Wyatt came home from the northern fence line at 6 in the evening to find the kitchen table covered in papers. 2 women he'd never seen in the same room before with their heads bent close together, and a bread operation that was somehow still running correctly despite the chaos, because Clara had apparently managed the bread schedule around the document review in the way she managed everything by making a timeline and sticking to it. He stood in the doorway and assessed the scene with the particular look he wore when he was encountering something he hadn't planned for, but was prepared to accept. Wyatt Mercer, Clara said without looking up. This is Margaret Ellis. She came from Billings, Mrs. Ellis, Wyatt said. Mr. Mercer, Margaret looked up. You have a remarkable kitchen. Clara built it, he said. Are you staying? Clara did look up then to meet his eyes. He gave the small nod that meant yes before she asked. Yes, Clara said to Margaret, you're staying. The document review took 3 days. What emerged from it was not a simple story. Nothing about Victor was simple, but it was a coherent one. Margaret's records, combined with what Clara could reconstruct from her own time in Chicago, and the documentation Hartley had gathered through his legal inquiries, drew a picture that was detailed enough to have edges. 3 women across 7 years. A consistent method. Locate a woman in a financially or emotionally precarious situation. Establish dependency gradually and without visible coercion. Arrange the finances in ways that benefited him and were difficult to unpick afterward. Discredit the woman preemptively with anyone who might later be a witness. And then, when the woman eventually found a way out, use legal and financial pressure to recover whatever he considered his and to protect his reputation. He had never been formally charged with anything. He'd been careful enough, in each situation, to keep the most actionable elements just inside the legal lines, or at least inside the lines as they existed in Illinois, where his lawyer knew which judges played cards, with which businessmen. Montana was different territory. Hartley, when Clara presented him with the consolidated documentation, spent an entire morning going through it. He made notes in the margins. He asked specific questions about dates and document chains. He was not a man who showed much on his face, but by the end of the morning he had the quality of someone doing arithmetic that was coming out to a number larger than expected. This would interest a territorial investigator, he said. If the pattern shows the financial manipulation crossed state lines, and it appears it did, in at least 2 of these cases it becomes a federal matter. Could you contact an investigator? Clara said. Hartley looked at her. That would require your willingness to testify formally, not just provide documents. Personal testimony under oath in a proceeding that would be public record. She'd known this was coming. She'd known it since she'd sent the letter to Margaret, since she'd sat with the financial records spread across the kitchen table, since she'd made the decision not to run again. She had turned it over every night for 2 weeks, the same way you turned over a stone to see what was underneath, not because you didn't know. It would be unpleasant, but because knowing was better than not knowing. Yes, she said, I'm willing. It will be difficult, he said. He'll have lawyers who will make it difficult. I expect so. He looked at the documents again. Mrs. Ellis? Across the table, Margaret had been watching this exchange. She had the look of someone who'd been carrying something for a long time, and could finally see a little way ahead the possibility of setting it down. Yes, she said, quieter than Clara, but steady. Hartley made a note. I'll write to Caleb Dyer. He's the territorial investigator for this district. He's thorough, and he's not easily leaned on, which is relevant given who we're dealing with. How long, Clara said, for a response? a week, perhaps 2. For any formal proceeding, he paused. These things take time. You should prepare for months. Months. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the mountains beyond, at the long spring sky. Months of Victor knowing that she was building something against him. Months of him having time to counter, to reframe, to arrange. She knew what months gave him. All right, she said. Then we use the time well. Victor used his time well, too. The first sign came from Teague at the grain supply, another visit from a man asking questions. This time, with what Teague described as a specific focus on whether the bread operations contracts were legitimate, whether Clara had the authority to negotiate on behalf of Ironridge, whether there were any irregularities in the financial arrangements. The questions were probing for something to use. She understood that. She also understood that if the operation was clean, and it was, she'd made sure of it, then the probing would find nothing, and the finding of nothing was its own kind of answer. The second sign was more direct. A letter from a Chicago law firm addressed to Wyatt Mercer, formally asserting that Clara Bennett had departed Chicago in breach of certain financial arrangements, and that Mr. Victor Hale was seeking compensation for losses incurred. Wyatt brought the letter to the kitchen and read it to her with the particular flatness of someone reading something they find contemptible but want to handle accurately. What financial arrangements, she said. It doesn't specify. 'Cause there weren't any. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He paid for my mother's medical care. He paid for the funeral and the rent. He never spoke of it as a loan, and I never signed anything saying it was. He structured it so I felt the weight of it without any document that named what it was. Hartley will need to hear that. Hartley already has. She looked at the letter. It's not a real claim, it's pressure. He wants to make this expensive and slow for you. Expensive enough that you decide I'm not worth the cost. Wyatt folded the letter. Let me worry about what's worth the cost to me. I'm telling you what his strategy is, I heard you. He tucked the letter into his pocket. And his strategy only works if we start calculating the way he wants us to. We're not going to do that, she looked at him. You're going to have legal fees, Clara. His voice wasn't sharp, just firm. The way he was firm when he'd made a decision and was past the discussion. I know what I'm taking on. I've known since before Victor walked through the door. Stop trying to give me an exit. She stopped. She felt the old habit in it, the habit of making yourself easier to abandon, of preemptively offering people the out so they left on terms you'd provided rather than terms they'd chosen. She'd done it all her adult life, and she hadn't noticed it was a habit until just now, looking at Wyatt's expression. All right, she said, good. He went to get his coat. I'm going to go look at the north fence. Colton says it needs another half-mile of Wyatt. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for any specific thing, for the whole shape of it. He stood there for a moment with his coat half on, and the ghost of the smile did what it sometimes did, went a little further than usual, became something she could actually see. Don't thank me yet, he said. Ask me again in 6 months. The third thing Victor did was the one she hadn't anticipated, which meant she'd underestimated him in a specific way she should have known better than to. He went after Nora, not directly. He was too precise for direct. What he did was contact the county recorder's office in Helena with a request for information about the guardianship arrangements for one Nora Mercer, minor child of Wyatt Mercer, and to inquire whether there were any formal records regarding the child's welfare since the death of her mother. He framed it as a concerned citizen, which was the kind of phrasing that opened doors with bureaucrats who dealt in paper and had no way of knowing what the paper was actually for. Hartley found out about it through a contact in Helena. He rode out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with the controlled urgency of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in motion, so there was something to do while receiving it. He told Wyatt first. Clara was in the kitchen and heard the change in the front room, not words exactly, but the quality of silence that followed words that needed to land before anyone spoke again. Then Wyatt came through the kitchen door with a look on his face she hadn't seen before. It was fear. Not the managed kind he wore when he was working out a financial problem or a ranch crisis. The unmanaged kind, the kind that lived under everything else, and came up when the thing you couldn't afford to lose was suddenly in someone's line of sight. She put the spoon down, he told her. She listened to every word. He's not going to take her, she said when he finished. He doesn't want to take her. That's not... Wyatt stopped. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something in that he didn't have words for yet. He wants to make me think he could. He wants me spending energy on that instead of on what you're building with Hartley. Yes, she said, that's exactly what he wants. So what do we do? She thought about it. Truly thought, not the fast, reflexive thinking that produced anxiety, but the slower kind that produced clarity. She thought about what Victor needed this move to accomplish, and what would happen if it accomplished nothing. You file first, she said. You don't wait for his inquiry to become anything. You file a formal record of guardianship, current and in good standing, with documented evidence of Nora's welfare. Hartley knows how to do this. She looked at Wyatt steadily. You take the ground before he can claim it's disputed. His inquiry goes into a file next to your filing, and it looks like what it is interference by an uninvolved party. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's yes. That's right. It also means there's a formal record of Victor Hale involving himself in the welfare of a child he has no connection to, which is useful documentation for Dyer's investigation. He looked at her. You thought that through fast. I've been thinking about what he might do for 2 months, she said. I've been making a list. Does the list have anything we haven't already dealt with? She considered. 2 or 3 things. But none of them are as targeted as this one, which means he's escalating, which means the investigation is making him nervous. Is that good or bad? Both. She picked the spoon back up. Nervous people make more moves. More moves means more evidence. But nervous people also make desperate moves, and desperate moves are less predictable. She looked at him directly. We need Dyer here sooner rather than later. Wyatt turned and went back to find Hartley before the man had even finished unsaddling his horse. Caleb Dyer arrived on a Friday in late April, which was the week the first real warmth came into the air, and the yard went from mud season into the tentative early green that Montana offered like an apology for winter. He was younger than Clara had imagined, perhaps 35, lean, with the specific unhurried quality of a man who'd learned that hurrying was what made people sloppy. He had a leather satchel that he didn't put down and eyes that moved through a room with professional thoroughness before settling. He shook hands with Wyatt and nodded to Hartley and looked at Clara with an expression that was neutral in the way that genuinely neutral was, without the condescension that sometimes hid behind it. Miss Bennett, he said, Mr. Dyer. I've read the documentation Hartley sent. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where they all ended up eventually. I want to hear the rest of it from you. In your own words, your own order. Take as long as you need. She made coffee and sat across from him and told him. Not from the beginning, she'd been telling it in fragments for months now, and she'd worked out, in that time, which parts were most important and which parts could be reconstructed from the paper trail. She told it the way she'd written the supply proposals and the railroad contract proposal and the financial documentation, in order, with the numbers visible and the uncertainties named, without embellishment and without minimization. He listened for 2 hours. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable questions that required her to be accurate about things she'd rather have been vague about specific dates, specific documents, specific moments where she'd understood less than she should have. She answered them. The discomfort of accuracy was considerably less than the alternative. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes he'd made. Mrs. Ellis's documentation is significant, he said. Combined with what you've described and what Hartley has gathered from the other cases, the pattern is clear. He looked up. I want to speak to the other women. 2 of them have indicated they're willing, Hartley said, from the doorway where he'd been standing throughout. The 3rd is still deciding. Give her time, Dyer said. He looked back at Clara. I'm going to be direct with you. The case as it stands is strong enough to warrant a formal federal inquiry. It's strong enough that Victor Hale is going to know that, and knowing it is going to make him move. He's already moving, Clara said. He'll move faster. He'll try to discredit the documentation, discredit the witnesses, and if he can't do either, he'll try to settle quickly enough to avoid the public record. Dyer's expression didn't change. I'm telling you this so you're not surprised. Not so you'll change your mind. I'm not going to change my mind, she said. Good. He closed his notebook. I'll need access to the ranch's financial records, the loan history, the bank correspondence, everything related to the Helena Bank inquiries. What Hale has been doing on that front is relevant to the pattern. Whatever you need, Wyatt said from the doorway. Dyer looked at him. Something passed between the 2 men that Clara read as a mutual recognition of the fact of the situation, of what it meant, of the commitment it required. Men who worked in territory like this understood, she was learning, that there were things worth a fight and things that weren't, and that the distinguishing factor was usually something simpler than people expected. Colton, Wyatt called toward the yard. Colton appeared in the doorway, with the expression of a man who'd been within earshot the entire time and was mildly offended to be called like he hadn't been. Get Mr. Dyer whatever he needs from the records room, Wyatt said. Colton looked at Dyer, looked at Clara, looked back at Wyatt. Already started pulling them, he said, and disappeared again. The investigation's formal opening didn't arrive quietly. Victor had connections in Helena, she'd known that. Everyone had known that, and one of those connections apparently fed him the information within days. What arrived in the weeks following Dyer's visit was not a single attack, but a campaign in the most literal sense. Multiple fronts, timed close enough together to create the sensation of being surrounded. Forsyth at the railroad camp received a letter from a Chicago business entity suggesting that the Ironridge bread supply operation might be in contractual dispute and that the camp might wish to seek alternative arrangements pending resolution. Forsyth, to his significant credit, wrote directly to Clara asking what the situation was, rather than acting on the letter without inquiry. She wrote back the same day with the facts, clean and documented. Forsyth responded, "Continue current arrangement." Not interested in parties who communicate through innuendo. She kept his letter. She added it to the documentation file she was maintaining for Dyer, labeled and dated. Everything went into the file. The second front was in Millhaven itself, which was smaller and therefore more vulnerable to the kind of pressure that worked through reputation. A man she didn't know, not the same one who'd spoken to Teague, began appearing in the general store and the post office, and people began hearing, in the indirect way that things circulated in small towns, that the woman at Ironridge had left complicated circumstances in Chicago, that there were questions about her arrangement at the ranch, that perhaps things at Ironridge were not as solid as they appeared. Clara heard about this from Mrs. Forsyth, wife of the supply store owner, who told her on a Tuesday with the particular directness of a woman who found rumor campaigns contemptible and said so. "I want you to know that no one with sense is taking it seriously, Mrs." Forsyth said. "I appreciate that," Clara said. "And I want you to know that if you hear anything specific names, anything documented, I'd like to know." "I'll keep my ears open," Mrs. Forsyth said with the settled authority of a woman who had been keeping her ears open in this town for 20 years and knew exactly how useful that was. The third front was Nora. Not an inquiry this time. Victor's lawyer sent a formal letter to Wyatt, suggesting that given the presence of a woman of uncertain character and legal standing in the household, and given the questions being raised about Ironridge's financial situation, it might be appropriate for the county to conduct a welfare review of the minor child. Wyatt read the letter at the kitchen table. His face did the controlled thing, the thing that meant he was somewhere between anger and something colder and steadier than anger. "Hartley filed the guardianship documentation 2 weeks ago," he said. "I know. This letter is 3 weeks too late to matter legally. I know that too." He set the letter down. "He's doing it because he thinks I'll react." "You're allowed to react," she said. "You're just not allowed to react in the way he's planned for." He looked at her. "I want to go to Chicago, and I know," she said. "Don't," he breathed. He picked the letter up and set it in the documentation pile she kept on the corner of the table, which was its own statement. "Doing well," Clara said quietly. "Nora, she's been talking more. To me. To Colton. Yesterday she asked Denny if she could ride with him to the fence line." Something moved across Wyatt's face that was entirely different from the last 5 minutes. "He let her," he said. "He came and asked me first. I told him to ask you." "I didn't know he asked. He was probably afraid you'd say no. He didn't want to disappoint her." Wyatt sat there for a moment, with the letter in the pile, and the kitchen warm around them, and some complicated internal reorganization happening behind his eyes. "He didn't say anything to me. He said she sat the horse better than 2 of the new hands." He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. It startled them both. It was 3 days later, in the first week of May, that Nora came into the kitchen in the morning and sat at the work table while Clara was setting the bread, and said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about how to say something for a long time, "Are you going to marry my father?" Clara's hand stopped. She looked at Nora, who was watching her with the dark-eyed seriousness that was the girl's native expression, the one that lived underneath all the other ones. "I don't know," Clara said. "Do you want to?" She thought about the honest answer. She had spent enough time around dishonest ones to know what they cost. "I think I might," she said. "But that's not a thing I'd decide by myself. There are 2 more people involved in that decision. Me and Papa, yes." Nora considered this. "Papa looks at you different than he looks at other people." "How does he look at me?" Nora thought about it with the concentration of someone searching for the right word in a vocabulary that was still growing. "Like you might disappear," she said finally, "but also like he doesn't want to look away in case you don't." Clara set the dough on the board and stood there for a moment with flour on her hands, and something happening in her chest that she didn't have a name for that wasn't also terrifying. "That's a very precise observation," she said. "I watch people," Nora said simply. "I know you do." The girl looked at her hands in her lap. "I'd be okay with it," she said. "If you wanted to know." Clara looked at the child who'd been silent for months and had found her voice again in this kitchen, who arranged spoons by length and left stones by the stove, and had put her hand over Clara's in the bread dough on a cold March afternoon and said, without words, something that had rearranged everything. "Thank you," Clara said. "That matters to me a great deal." Nora nodded, satisfied with the accuracy of this exchange, and went back to her spoons. The weak dicer sent word that the federal inquiry was formally opened and that Victor Hale had been served notice. 2 things happened at Ironridge that were completely unrelated to Victor, But that mattered anyway, because life didn't pause for one crisis at a time. The first was that the north fence came down in a spring storm and 40 head of cattle wandered onto the edge of Calder's land, which required 3 days of diplomacy that fell entirely on Wyatt and Colton, and produced, unexpectedly, a conversation with Silas Calder that Wyatt described afterward as less hostile than expected. Calder apparently had heard about the federal inquiry through the same Helena connections that had served Victor, and had recalculated Ironridge's position accordingly. A ranch that could withstand Victor Hale's financial pressure was a different kind of neighbor than one that couldn't. The second thing was the bread. The bread was simply working. Completely and measurably working, in the way that things worked when you'd built them right and kept building them. The railroad camp had expanded the order twice. A general store in a town 20 miles east had written asking if they could arrange a supply. The profit margin, when Clara presented the monthly numbers to Wyatt, was not dramatic. Nothing about running a bread operation was ever dramatic in the financial sense, but it was real, and it was consistent, and it was growing. She presented the numbers at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, with Hartley present because he was at the ranch for another meeting with Dyer's office. He looked at the figures and said, in the dry way that was apparently how he expressed admiration, "The bank in hell is going to have a difficult time arguing financial instability." "That's the idea," Clara said. Wyatt was looking at the figures with the expression he wore when arithmetic was confirming something he'd already decided he believed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We should expand. There's a store in Langton asking." "We'd need another oven," she said. "How long to get one?" 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we order from Billings." "Order it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her with the expression Nora had described, the one she'd been unable to look at directly for weeks, because it was too much of something she wasn't ready for yet. She ordered the oven the next morning. The letter from Rebecca Sloane arrived in the second week of May. Hartley brought it. He gave it to Clara without preamble and said only, "Read it before you decide anything," which told her it was significant before she opened it. Rebecca Sloane was from St. Louis. She had met Victor 9 years ago, which meant before Margaret, which made her the earliest case they had, and what had happened to her was the architecture Clara and Margaret had already described, but with one additional dimension. Rebecca had spent the intervening 9 years documenting it with a thoroughness that was almost professional, and she had been looking, she wrote, for exactly the moment that Clara and Margaret and the others represented. She had copies of financial documents, correspondence, a signed statement from a banker in Illinois who'd been present at one of the account restructurings and had later become uncomfortable enough with what he'd witnessed to put his discomfort in writing. She had been waiting for enough people to make it impossible to dismiss. "I have been called unreliable," she wrote. "I have been called confused and bitter and unable to manage my own affairs. I have heard every version of that story for 9 years. I would very much like to hear someone else's version now." Clara read the letter twice. Then she put it down and sat in the kitchen for a while, and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant, not just for her, not just for the case, but for the 9 years this woman had spent maintaining a careful record against the possibility of a moment that kept not arriving. She wrote back that afternoon. She wrote, "Your moment has arrived. We need you." The stove burned steady. The starter rose in its jar. Outside, the Montana Spring was doing what Montana Spring did, arriving tentatively, offering warmth in small pieces, as if it understood that warmth given too quickly wasn't trusted. Clara folded the letter and put it with the others and thought about Victor's careful architecture of isolation, the way it required each woman to believe she was alone, to carry her story without witnesses, to measure the weight of her own experience against his confident reframing and find herself uncertain. What he'd never counted on was that the women he'd isolated would eventually find each other and discover that their stories fit together like pieces of a map, each one showing part of the same territory. He'd made one woman look uncertain. He'd made 2 women look like a pattern. 3 became undeniable. 4 became a reckoning. Clara picked up the bread that had been cooling on the shelf and wrapped it and set it with tomorrow's delivery, and the kitchen held its warmth, and the evening came down over Ironridge Ranch in the long, slow way of May evenings, generous with light, in no particular hurry to end. Rebecca Sloane arrived in Millhaven on the last Friday of May with 2 leather cases and a cardboard box tied with twine, and she was nothing like Clara had imagined. She'd imagined someone damaged in a visible way, the way trauma sometimes showed on the outside, in posture or in eyes that had lost their steadiness. Rebecca was 51, broad-shouldered, with the practical hands of someone who'd spent 9 years doing things that needed doing rather than waiting for life to arrange itself, and she walked off the stage with the deliberate pace of a woman who had been moving toward this particular destination for a very long time and was not going to rush the last 100 yards of it. She shook Clara's hand in the street and looked at her directly and said, "You look like you've been fighting." "I have," Clara said. "Good." Rebecca picked up one of her cases. "So have I. Let's finish it." They rode out to Ironridge in the late afternoon light, and Rebecca asked questions the whole way about Dyer, about the documentation, about the other women, about the timeline of the federal inquiry. She asked them the way someone asked who'd already read everything available and needed the gaps filled. Clara answered and found herself, for the first time in months, talking to someone who didn't need the situation explained from the beginning, who already understood the terrain. By the time they reached the ranch, Clara had told her everything that mattered. Rebecca had asked 3 questions that Clara hadn't considered before, and that immediately clarified things she'd been uncertain about. One of them about the specific banking instrument Victor had used in Rebecca's case, and whether the same instrument appeared in Margaret's documentation turned out, when they checked that evening, to be the thread that connected the financial pattern across all 4 cases in a way that was explicit rather than inferential. Hartley, when they showed him the following morning, looked at it for a long time and said, "This is the piece Dyer has been looking for." The federal inquiry hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of June in Billings. The weeks between Rebecca's arrival and the hearing were the strangest Clara had lived through, stranger, even, than the months of building and fighting, because this was waiting, which was its own kind of work. The bread operation ran. The new oven had arrived and been installed and was burning correctly, which had taken 2 adjustments to the flue that Colton made with the concentrated irritation of a man solving a problem that shouldn't have been a problem. The second delivery route was established. The numbers held. She worked through those weeks the way she'd worked through every difficult period of her life, by doing the thing in front of her, and then the next thing, and letting the accumulation of done things be the answer to the fear of undone ones. Victor's lawyers sent 3 more letters. Hartley handled them. She read the summaries he provided and filed them, and didn't let herself spend more than 10 minutes on each one, because 10 minutes was what they deserved, and more than that was what Victor wanted. Nora, in those weeks, became the unexpected steadying force. Not because she did anything remarkable, she simply continued being exactly herself, in the way children did when they'd decided the situation was safe enough to be themselves in. She came to the kitchen every morning. She'd taken over the spoon organization as a permanent responsibility and had extended it to the crocks along the back wall, each one labeled in her careful 6-year-old printing with the date it had been started. She talked more, still in the careful, considered way that was her nature, and the things she said were often more useful than what the adults around her managed. One evening, when Clara was sitting at the kitchen table going through the testimony notes, Hartley had prepared the questions Victor's lawyers would likely ask. The ways she needed to be precise. Nora came in, looked at the papers and said, "Are you scared?" "Yes," Clara said. "Me too sometimes." Nora sat down across from her. "But you know what you did. He can't change that." Clara looked at her. "You know what happened," Nora said. "He can say different things, but he can't change what you know." It was a 6-year-old's logic. It was also, Clara realized, exactly right in the way that simple things were sometimes exactly right. "Thank you," she said. "You already said that to me before," Nora said, and went back to her spoons. They went to Billings on a Monday. Clara, Wyatt, Hartley, Margaret, and Rebecca. Denny drove the wagon for the first leg and managed not to say anything foolish, which Clara considered a genuine achievement, given that he was clearly emotional about the whole enterprise in a way he had no framework for expressing. Clara had been in courtrooms twice in her life before this, both times as an observer, never as a participant, and the federal hearing room in Billings was different from either, not a courtroom in the formal sense, but a proceeding room, wood-paneled and close, with a long table for the inquiry officers and chairs arranged along the sides, and the specific atmosphere of a place where things were decided. Victor was already there when they arrived. She had known he would be. She had prepared for it, the sight of him, the composed face, the careful suit, the way he held himself in rooms where he expected to win. She had walked through the preparation with Hartley, with Wyatt, with herself in the quiet of the kitchen at 4 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. She had built the moment in her mind enough times that the actual moment couldn't surprise her. He looked at her when she came in. His expression was the one she knew managed, controlled, with something underneath it that had hardened since the last time she'd seen him. He looked at Wyatt behind her, and at the women who came in after Margaret, steady and direct, Rebecca with her leather cases and her 9 years of documentation, and her expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this room. His lawyer leaned in and said something to him. Victor looked back at the table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on her knees. She breathed. The inquiry officers asked questions for 2 days. They asked Clara about dates, documents, specific transactions, specific moments. Victor's lead lawyer, A man named Carver, who had the practiced calm of someone very expensive, challenged her precision on minor points, questioned her characterization of events, suggested that what she remembered as coercion was in fact assistance she'd later reframed. He was good. She'd known he would be good. She answered each question the way she'd answered every important question in her life since leaving Chicago. Precisely, without embellishment, naming the uncertainties honestly. When she didn't remember a specific date, she said she didn't remember a specific date. When she did remember, she said so and gave the evidence she had for it. Carver kept looking for the version of her that would collapse under the implication that she was confused, or emotional, or mistaken. The version Victor had told everyone about, the version that was his best defense. She wasn't that version. She had stopped being that version somewhere between a carpetbag and a jar of sourdough starter and a Montana kitchen in January, and whatever Carver did for the next 2 days, he couldn't put her back in it. Margaret testified on the second day. She was more emotional than Clara. Her voice broke twice, and she stopped and gathered herself with the visible effort of someone doing a hard thing rather than an easy one, but she was also precise, and the documentation she'd kept for 4 years was what it was. Meticulous, dated, organized by a woman who had understood from the beginning that her word alone would not be enough, and had therefore never relied on it alone. Rebecca testified last. She was the calmest of the three of them, which surprised the inquiry officers, Clara thought, because calm women of a certain age in proceedings like this were often read as unfeeling. Rebecca was not unfeeling. She had simply been feeling the same things for 9 years and had worked out in that time how to feel them without losing precision. She presented the banking documentation. She presented the signed statement from the Illinois banker. She laid out in 45 methodical minutes the architecture of what Victor had done, not just to her, not just to Clara or Margaret, but to the shape of the thing as a whole, the method underneath the individual instances. The inquiry officers were quiet for a long time when she finished. Victor's lawyer made his closing arguments with everything he had, which was considerable. He spoke about the difficulty of reconstructing past events, about the unreliability of memory, about the interpretation of financial arrangements that had been entered voluntarily, about the danger of allowing a proceeding like this to be driven by the accumulated grievances of women who shared a personal connection to one man. One of the inquiry officers looked up from her notes and said, "The women in this proceeding share a personal connection to one man." Yes, that's precisely the point. They were back in Millhaven by Thursday. The inquiry officers would take several weeks to produce their findings. Dyer had told them before they left Billings that the evidence supported federal charges and that he expected the findings to confirm that, but he'd said it in the careful way of someone who'd seen expected things not happen and wasn't going to promise outcomes he didn't control. Claire accepted that. She'd gotten comfortable in the months since January with doing everything she could and then living in the space where her control ended. The ranch was exactly as they'd left it. Colton had kept everything running with the thoroughness of a man who hadn't needed supervision in 30 years. And was mildly insulted by the implication that 4 days might change that. The bread was made. The delivery had gone out. The new oven was working. And he had additionally fixed the latch on the bunkhouse door that had been sticking since February and that no one had gotten around to. She walked into the kitchen and put her hand on the stove and felt its warmth and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. She had done the thing she'd gone to do. Whatever happened next was in the hands of people who would look at the evidence and decide. She had given them everything she had. It was enough. She believed for the first time in a long time that enough was actually enough. The federal findings arrived 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in late July when the heat had finally come properly to Montana, and the kitchen was warm from the stove and warm from the air, and she had the back window propped open for the cross breeze. Dyer brought the letter himself, which told her something before she opened it. She read it standing at the kitchen table with Wyatt beside her, and Colton in the doorway, and the summer outside the window going about its business. The inquiry had found sufficient evidence to support federal charges of fraud, financial coercion, and deliberate manipulation across multiple victims. Victor Hale had been taken into federal custody in Chicago 2 days prior. His assets had been frozen pending the criminal proceeding. She read it twice. She set it down. Wyatt said nothing. He put his hand on her shoulder just there, steady, without pressure, and she let it be there and looked at the letter and felt the thing that she hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph and not relief and not even joy exactly, but a kind of profound, exhausted quiet. The quiet of a long weight being put down. The quiet of a door closing behind you on a room you'd been trying to leave for years. Colton said from the doorway, "I'm going to tell the hands," and left before she could respond, which was Colton's way of giving her a moment without appearing to give her a moment. She looked at Wyatt. It's not finished, she said. There'll be a trial. His lawyer, he said. It could take a year more. I know that too, she looked at him. He was looking back at her, with the expression that Nora had named, like she might disappear, but also like he wasn't going to look away. She had spent months not looking at it directly, because it was too much of something she didn't have the capacity to receive. Back then, when she was still too full of the work of surviving to have room for anything else. She had room now. Ask me, she said. He blinked. What? Whatever you've been not asking me for 2 months. Ask me. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, which was Wyatt, being careful in the way he was always careful, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that some things deserved the right words. I don't want you to stay because of the kitchen, he said finally, or because of the bread operation, or because Ironridge needs what you built. A pause. I want you to stay because you want to be here in this house, with me and Nora. He stopped. That's not well put. It's fine, she said. I understood it. I'm not asking you to give up, Wyatt. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going anywhere. I told you that in January, and I've been telling you with everything I've done since January. She held his gaze. I'm here because I want to be here. That's the only reason I've been here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, the quiet and undecorated way, he said things that mattered. Will you marry me? It wasn't quite a question. It was more like a statement he was offering her the option to correct. She didn't correct it. Yes, she said, the same way she'd said yes to the kitchen in January. Without theater, without anything that wasn't true. They told Nora that evening. She was in the kitchen, which was where she was most evenings, reorganizing the crock labels in a system she'd updated to include the temperature at which each had been started, because she'd decided this was relevant information. Wyatt crouched down to her level, which was something Clara had watched him learn to do not as performance, but as genuine attention. The physical acknowledgement that her perspective was worth meeting at its own height. Clara's going to stay, he said, permanently. We're going to get married. Nora looked at him, then she looked at Clara, then back at him. I know, she said. Wyatt blinked. You know, I told her it was okay weeks ago. Nora looked at Clara with the slight exasperation of someone whose careful work had apparently not been communicated upward in the organization. You said you'd think about it. I did think about it, Clara said. Good. Nora turned back to her Crocs. The sourdough one needs a new label. The old one got wet. Wyatt stood up. He looked at Clara with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was laughter, not the suppressed version, not the ghost, but actual laughter, unguarded, startled out of him by his daughter's complete absence of sentimentality. Clara felt it pull at her own chest, and then she was laughing too. The kitchen warm around them, Nora placidly relabeling Crocs. They married in September when the aspens had gone gold, and the mornings were cold again, but not the deep cold yet. The cold that still allowed for an outdoor ceremony if you were practical about it. It was small, which was what they both wanted, independently and without needing to discuss it. Colton stood beside Wyatt. Margaret, who had come back from Billings, stood beside Clara. Rebecca sent a letter and a generous gift and the note, you fought well. Enjoy the part that comes after. Nora wore a dress she'd picked herself, which was the one with the dark blue trim because she'd decided it matched the mountains better than the other options, a piece of reasoning no one could argue with. She stood very straight through the whole thing and held the small bouquet of late wildflowers. She'd picked herself at 5 a.m. before anyone else was up. At the end of the ceremony, she took Clara's hand. Not with ceremony, not with announcement. Just the way she'd taken it in the yard back in March, the simple, decided gesture of a child who'd made up her mind. Clara held it. She looked down at Nora's serious face, the dark eyes, the careful attention. Can I call you Mom? Nora said. Clara had known this was coming. She'd thought about how she'd feel when it came, had tried to prepare for it, the way she prepared for things with attention, with forethought, with the attempt to be ready. None of that preparation had accounted for how it would actually feel, which was enormous and specific, and nothing like what words made it sound like. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. Nora nodded, satisfied. Then she looked at the mountains. The label came off the rye crock again, she said. Clara laughed. And it was real uncontrolled, startled out of her, the best kind. Victor's trial began in the spring of the following year. By then, 5 women had agreed to testify. The 5th had come forward after the federal charges were public, which was the thing Dyer had predicted, that visibility created more visibility, that the women who had been isolated in their individual silence found their way toward a collective sound once that sound existed to find. Clara testified in April. She traveled to Chicago with Wyatt, which was the first time she'd been back since January of the previous year, and the city looked like itself, enormous and indifferent, conducting its business without reference to her, and she found, walking its streets, that it didn't have the power over her that she'd feared it might. Places held power when you were afraid of them. She was not afraid. Victor's lawyers did what Hartley had predicted. They were skilled and expensive, and they worked the doubt from every available angle. Clara sat on the stand and told the truth in the precise, documented, unhurried way she'd been telling it for a year. And she watched Carver try to find the version of her that would crack or contradict herself, or dissolve into the kind of uncertainty that made testimony look like grievance. And she was not that version. She was the woman who had crossed half the country with $11 and a jar of sourdough starter, and built something from nothing on the Montana frontier, and then built something larger than herself by refusing to carry her evidence alone. She was not uncertain. She was in fact the most certain she had ever been. Rebecca testified, Margaret testified, the other women testified. The banker from Illinois, whose statement Rebecca had carried for 9 years, testified in person. The jury was out for 2 days. The verdict came back on a Wednesday morning. Guilty on 6 counts: fraud, financial coercion, manipulation of legal documentation, and 3 additional counts that Hartley had explained to her in terms she'd understood, and that Carver had failed to adequately rebut. She heard it in the gallery. Wyatt was beside her. She felt his hand close over hers when the foreman read the word guilty the first time, and she let her hand stay where it was, and she listened to the other 5 counts, and then she looked at Victor. He was looking at the table, not at her. She had expected in some part of herself that he would look at her with the old look, the one that said she was a problem he would eventually solve, the one that had followed her across 1,000 miles of train track and through a Montana winter and into every quiet moment where the old fear surfaced. He didn't look at her. He sat very still and looked at the table, and he was in the end just a man. Just the specific ordinary man who had depended on other people's silence to be larger than he was, and who was now exactly as large as he'd always actually been. She walked out of the courtroom in the April morning and stood on the steps in the Chicago air and breathed. Wyatt came out beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You all right?" he said eventually. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He accepted that because he was Wyatt, and because honest answers were the kind he trusted. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, not for support. Exactly. Or not only for support, but for the warmth of it, the specific warmth of a person who had chosen to be beside you and meant it. They went home to Montana the next morning. There are things Clara understood, in the years that followed, that she hadn't understood when she was 23 in a Chicago bakery, telling herself she was being practical. She understood that dependency built slowly enough is nearly invisible until you're already inside it. That the kindness of someone who intends to use you costs you the ability to distinguish real kindness from strategic kindness, and that recovering that ability takes longer than recovering anything else. She understood that the most dangerous thing a person can do to another person is not violence. It's the careful, patient removal of their certainty in their own experience. Make someone doubt what they know, and they'll hand you everything else. She understood that the women in that courtroom had not been weak. They had been isolated, which was a different thing entirely. Weakness was a condition of character. Isolation was a condition imposed from outside methodically, by someone who understood that human beings were not designed to carry their truth without witnesses. Take away the witnesses, and you don't make the truth smaller, you just make it harder to hold. She understood that the bread had not been incidental. The bread had been the thing that kept her hands honest when everything else was uncertain, that built the relationship with Nora through warmth and smell and proximity rather than words, that gave the ranch hands something to be invested in, that bought Ironridge the time and financial ground it needed to survive Victor's attacks. She had not used the bread. She had simply done the work she knew how to do, and the work had been real. And real work has a way of connecting to other real things until you look up and find yourself standing in the middle of something solid. She understood that Wyatt was not her rescuer, and that this was the most important thing about what they had. He had been someone who stood beside her not in front, not pulling her along, and that distinction was everything. She had rescued herself, in the way that self-rescue actually worked, not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 small decisions to keep going, to tell the truth, to do the next thing, to stay. By the time Nora was 12, the Ironridge bread operation was supplying 4 contracts, and Clara had begun, one morning a month, teaching women from Millhaven and the surrounding area how to manage a kitchen budget, negotiate a supply contract, and read the numbers in their own household ledgers. It had not been a plan. Mrs. Forsythe had asked one afternoon if Clara might be willing to show her daughter-in-law how to approach a supply negotiation, and Clara had said yes, and 3 other women had heard about it and asked, and it had grown the way things grew when they answered a need that was already there. The women who came brought different problems and different levels of starting knowledge, and Clara taught them the way she'd been taught, not from a curriculum, but from the specific situation in front of them, the particular number that didn't add up, the particular vendor whose pricing needed questioning. She was not patient in the way that was sometimes held up as a virtue, the soft, accommodating patience. She was patient in the way of someone who knew the work was real and took the time it took. Colton, who had approximately one opinion about most things, and held it until demonstrated otherwise, told Wyatt one evening that the sessions were good for the town. Wyatt told Clara. She noted it and appreciated the precision of it. Colton didn't say kind or charitable or generous. He said good, useful. He was in the end always exactly right. Nora grew up in the kitchen the way children grew up in the places that felt like home to them, by absorbing it without knowing she was absorbing it, by learning its rhythms before she learned to name them. By the time she was 10, she could read the fermentation timing on the sourdough better than anyone except Clara herself. She kept her crock labels in a system that had evolved 3 times and was now both comprehensive and slightly arcane, which was fine because she was the one who needed to understand it. She called Clara Mom every day of her life after that September. Not as ceremony as the ordinary word it became. The sourdough starter had been alive for 14 years by the time Nora asked about it. She was 15, sitting at the work table on a Saturday morning while Clara fed it, watching with the focused attention she gave to things she'd decided to actually understand rather than simply know. How old is it? She asked. It was my mother's, Clara said. She had it for 11 years before she gave it to me. So 25 years at least. Nora looked at the jar. It came all the way from Chicago. In my coat pocket, wrapped in cloth. What would have happened if you'd left it? Clara thought about this. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't think I could have. It was the last thing of hers I had. She looked at the jar, the same jar, replaced 3 times over the years, but always the same size and shape because that was what fit right in her hand. It kept being alive through everything. I suppose I needed to see that something could. Nora was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was putting something in the place where it would stay. I'm going to learn to make bread, she said, properly, like you do. You already know some of it. I know the timing. I don't know the feel yet. Clara moved over on the bench. Then put your hands in, she said. Nora put her hands in the dough. Clara guided them without taking over, just pressure, just direction. The teaching that happened through hands rather than words. The kitchen was warm in the early morning light, and outside the mountains held their distance, and the ranch moved into its Saturday in the unhurried way of a place that had found its own pace. This was what remained after all of it. The work that was real. The people who chose to stay. The bread that kept its patient life across years and miles, and every difficulty that came between the starting and the now. She had arrived in Montana with nothing except what she could carry, and what she could carry had turned out to be enough not because it was sufficient in itself, but because she had been willing to do the work of making it matter. She had not needed saving. She had needed what everyone needed, time and ground to stand on, and people willing to stand on it beside her. She had built the ground herself, plank by plank, loaf by loaf, number by number, in the cold and the uncertainty and the knowledge that there were no guarantees. The ground had held. Nora's hands found the rhythm in the dough, and Clara felt it, that moment when the motion stopped being mechanical and started being right, when the hands started listening instead of just pressing. There, Clara said. Nora looked up at her. That's it, Clara said. That's how you know. The morning light came through the kitchen window in the long way of Montana mornings, and the starter sat on the shelf in its jar, alive and rising, the same as it had always been, the same as it would continue to be patient, persistent, and entirely stubbornly itself.